Arc 5, Hive, Part 1. The place was nondescript, a hole in the wall in the midst of a long street of hole in the wall businesses. Everything was run down. For every given store or restaurant you passed, you could only guess if the place was still open or not. The pub had a sign on it reading Summer's Rock. There were iron bars on the windows and the curtains were drawn, but it would have been more unusual if that wasn't the case. It was that kind of area. The paint on the outside was peeling, and the rust from the bars had bled onto the gray-white paint below the windows. As we stepped inside, it became clear that Summer's Rock was one book that should be judged by its cover. It was dim, dingy, and depressing. The wood floor was stained the same dark gray as the counter of the bar. The curtains and tablecloths were dark green, and the only real color or brightness, if you could call it that, was the yellow light cast by ancient, burnt light bulbs. There were 3 people in Summer's Rock when we arrived. One was a sullen-looking 20-something girl with brown hair and a slightly wrinkled server's uniform, who glanced at us as we came in, but made no attempt to welcome us. There were 2 identical twins behind the bar in the far corner, probably her older brothers, busying themselves with washing glasses and studiously ignoring us. One of them was wearing a dress shirt and apron, looking the part of a bartender, while the other had a black t-shirt under a Hawaiian shirt. Besides the contrast in fashion, they were identical in height, haircut, features, and expression. A group of tables had been pulled together with chairs arranged around them, but we walked past them to a corner booth. Tattletale, Bitch, Gru, Regent, and I all arranged ourselves on the worn, cushioned benches. I was calling them that in my head, really, because they weren't Lisa, Brian, Rachel, and Alec. We were all in costume. As we settled in, the girl with the dour expression approached us, setting her notepad down on the table and then stared at me, the look in her eyes almost challenging. She didn't say a word. "Coke?" I ventured, feeling uncomfortable under the look. "No, Skitter," Tattletale nudged me. "She's deaf. If you want something, write it on the pad." To demonstrate, she reached across the table, took the pad, and wrote T, black. I took her cue and wrote down my order, then passed the note across the table to the boys and Bitch. The girl gave me an ugly look as she walked away with our orders. It had been a week since the incident with Bakuda. Lisa and Brian had stopped by several times as I spent my days in bed, giving me updates on the situation as it unfolded. At one point, they had even brought Alec and Bitch, and I'd been very relieved my dad hadn't been home at the time. Alec and Bitch weren't the polite house guests that Lisa and Brian were, and I suspected their presence and personalities would have raised more questions with my dad than they put to rest. Apparently, someone at the PHQ had named my costumed self Skitter. Lung had overheard something about it, and it had now spread through the city in the aftermath of his escape, which implied he was probably looking for me. As a newspaper article raised our possible involvement in the bombings that had taken place, as adversaries of Bakuda, my new name had come up yet again, so it looked like it was maybe catching on. I didn't love it, but I didn't love any of the names I'd come up with, so I could cope. It seemed that we had arrived a few minutes early, because the rest of the guests arrived within seconds of each other, as the server brought us our drinks. Kaiser came through the door with a girl on each arm, blondes with measurements like Playboy models. Kaiser wore armor head to toe, elaborately worked and topped with a crown of blades. The leader of Empire 88. The twins went by the names Fenja and Menja and were decked out in Valkyrie-style armor featuring countless little steel wings, along with closed-face helms. Had to admit, Kaiser liked his heavy hitters. These 2 could grow to be 3 stories tall, and they were 100 times more durable when they were. Purity entered a few steps behind him with several others following her. She was dressed in a white costume without any markings or symbols on it, but the fabric glowed softly. Her white hair and eyes glowed too, but it was more like they were made of heated magnesium than anything else. I couldn't look in her direction without getting spots in my eyes, and my mask had tinted lenses designed to reduce glare. The people that had come in with Purity were other members of Empire 88, Krieg, Knight, Fogg, and Hookwolf. It was interesting to see. because as far as I'd known, while every one of them had been a member of Empire 88 at some point in time, Purity had gone solo, while Night and Fog had splintered off to form their own duo in Boston not long after. All reunited, apparently. That wasn't even Kaiser's entire team. Aside from the rare exception like Lung reaching out to Bakuda when she'd been at Cornell, it seemed that most groups recruited new members from within their own city. Kaiser was different. He was one of the better-known American villains with a white supremacist agenda, and people sharing his ideals were either recruited from other states or they came to him. Most didn't stay with him for too long, for whatever reason, but it still made him the Brockton Bay resident with the most raw parahuman muscle at his beck and call. Kaiser sat at one end of the table in the center of the room, his people finding seats and chairs at the tables behind him. Purity didn't relax or order drinks, though. She sat in a chair a few feet behind Kaiser, folded her arms and crossed one ankle over the other, settling in to watch the proceedings. From my research online and digging through old newspaper articles, I knew Purity could create light and charge it with kinetic energy. She was like a human flashlight. If the light from the flashlight could punch through brick walls and tear city buses in half. As far as raw firepower went, she was up near the top of the list, a flying artillery turret. Coyle entered after Empire 88, all the more conspicuous because he was alone. No backup, no show of force. He was taller than Gru, but he was thin to the point of being skeletal. His skin-tight costume covered him head to toe, lacking even eye holes or openings for his nose and mouth, and the way it clung to his skin let you see his individual ribs and joints. The costume was black, and the only design on it was a white snake, with its head starting at Coyle's forehead, the tail extending down the back of his head, looping and winding over his entire body before finally ending at one of his ankles. He sat at the end of the table opposite Kaiser. "What's his deal?" I whispered to Tattletale. "Coyle? Can't say as far as his powers go, but he's one of the more powerful players in town. Considers himself a chess master. You know, like a master strategist tactician. Controls more than half of downtown with squads of top-notch personnel in the highest-end gear. Ex-military from around the world. If he even has powers, he's the only one in his organization who does." I nodded. Almost the opposite of Kaiser in that department. I might have asked more, but others were streaming into the room. Fault line. I knew of her from my research. She was 20-something, and her straight black hair was in a long, bristling ponytail. Her costume was weird, approximating something like a blend of riot gear, a martial arts uniform, and a dress. 4 people entered the room with her, and the 2 guys in the group were instantly the weirdest people in the room. I knew them by name, too. Neuter wasn't wearing a shirt, shoes, or gloves, which made it all the more apparent that his skin was neon orange from head to toe. He had light blue eyes, dark red hair that looked wet, and a 5-foot-long prehensile tail. Gregor the snail was morbidly obese, average height, with no hair on his entire body. His skin was milky white and slightly translucent, so you could see shadows beneath it where his organs were. Like someone else might have bad acne, he had bits of shell or scales crusting his skin. They looked almost like barnacles, but there was a spiral shape to them. You wouldn't have thought they were close by their body language, silence, and the sheer difference in appearance, but both had matching tattoos. Neuter's was just above his heart, while Gregor's was on his upper arm. It looked like the Greek omega symbol, but upside down, maybe a stylized U. The other 2 girls in Faultline's group were very normal by contrast. Labyrinth wore a dark green robe and mask with lines all over them. Spitfire wore in a red and black costume with a gas mask. I was surprised when Faultline deliberately walked by our table on her way to her seat, taking the long way around. As she passed us, she looked over Tattletale and me and sneered a little before taking the chair to Kaiser's right. "I'm going to go before all the seats get taken. If that's cool?" Gru spoke, and the rest of us nodded. Gru sat between Faultline and Coyle. "What was that with Faultline and you?" I murmured to Tattletale. "History?" "Nothing important," she replied. Regent leaned forward. "She and Tattletale have been feuding a little. Faultline upped the ante when she poached Spitfire from us when we were in the middle of trying to recruit her." Can't say why Faultline doesn't like Tattle, but I know Tattletale hates it when people act like they're smarter than her, and Faultline is smarter than her. Ow. Fuck, that hurt. Tattletale had kicked him under the table. They're mercenaries, right? I asked. Tattletale nodded. Faultline's crew does anything short of murder. You can say her personality sucks, you can say her powers suck, but I'll admit she's very good at finding hidden strengths in the people that work for her. See those two guys? When it came to powers, they got a bad roll of the dice. Became freaks that couldn't hope to pass in normal society, wound up homeless or living in the sewers. There's a story behind it, but they became a team. She made them effective, and they've only messed up 1 or 2 jobs so far. Gotcha, I said. Impressive. Keep in mind, though, we haven't screwed up any. We're 100%. They've done something like 3 times as many jobs as us, Regent pointed out. But we haven't failed any jobs, is the important thing, Tattletale stressed. Another group arrived, and it was like you could see a wave of distaste wash over the faces in the room. I had seen references on the web and news articles about these guys, but they weren't the sort you took pictures of. Skidmark, Moist, Squealer. 2 guys and a girl, the lot of them proving that capes weren't necessarily attractive, successful, or immune to the influences of substance abuse. Hardcore addicts and dealers who happened to have superpowers. Skidmark wore a mask that covered the top half of his face. The lower half was dark-skinned, with badly chapped lips and teeth that looked more like shelled pistachio nuts than anything else. He stepped up to the table and reached for a chair. Before he could move it, though, Kaiser kicked the chair out of reach, sending it toppling onto its side, sliding across the floor. "The fuck?" Skidmark snarled. "You can sit in a booth," Kaiser spoke. Even though his voice was completely calm, like he was talking to a stranger about the weather, it felt threatening. "This is because I'm black, hun. That's what you're all about, yeah?" Still calm, Kaiser replied, "You can sit in a booth because you and your team are pathetic, deranged losers that aren't worth talking to. The people at this table, I don't like them, but I'll listen to them. That isn't the case with you." "Fuck you. What about this guy?" Skidmark pointed at Gru. "I don't even know his name, and he's sitting." Faultline answered him. "His team hit the Brockton Bay Central Bank a week ago. They've gone up against Lung several times in the past, and they're still here, which is better than most. Not even counting the events of a week ago, he knows about the ABB, and he can share that information with the rest of us." She gave Gru a look that made it clear that he didn't have a choice if he wanted to sit at the table. He dipped his head in the smallest of nods in response. We discussed things beforehand and agreed on what details we'd share. "What have you done that's worth a seat at this table?" she asked Skidmark. "We hold territory." "You hold nothing," Gru answered, raising his voice, his powers warping it. "You're cowards that hold on to the areas nobody else cares about, making drugs and selling them to children. We sell to everyone, not just—" "Find a booth," Gru's echoing voice interrupted him. Skidmark gave him a look, then looked at the others sitting around the table. All still, every set of eyes he could see behind the masks was staring him down. "Assholes, puckered, juicy assholes, all of you," Skidmark snarled, stomping off to the booth where his teammates already sat. The serving girl picked up the fallen chair and restored it to its position at the table, not meeting anyone's eyes as she walked up to the table where Kaiser's people sat, put down her notepad, and waited for everyone to write down their orders. It struck me just why the pub had a deaf waitress. "I'll be taking a chair, I think," someone spoke from the door. Most heads turned to check out a male figure in a black costume with a red mask and top hat. It gave me sort of a Baron Samedi vibe. His teammates followed him into the room, all in matching costumes of red and black, differing only in design. A girl with a sun motif, a guy with bulky armor and a square mask, and a creature so large it had to crawl on its hands and knees to get through the door. It was hard to describe, approximating something like a 4-armed hairless gorilla with a vest, mask, and leggings in the red and black style its team was wearing, 6-inch claws tipping each of its fingers and toes. "The travelers, yes?" Coyle spoke, his voice smooth. "You're not local. You could call us nomadic. What was happening here was too interesting to pass up, so I decided we'd stop by for a visit." The guy with the top hat pulled off the first really formal bow I'd seen in my life. I go by Trickster. You know the rules here? Gru asked Trickster. We've been to similar places. I can guess. No fighting, no powers, no trying to bait others into causing trouble, or everyone else in the room puts aside all other grievances to put you down. Close enough. It's important to have neutral ground to meet, have civilized discussion. I won't argue that. Please, continue as if I wasn't here. When Trickster took a chair and put his feet up on the table, nobody complained, though Skidmark looked like he wanted to kill someone. The rest of the travelers settled in a booth not far from us. The gorilla thing sat on the floor, and it was still large enough to be at eye level with its teammates. Coil dipped his head in a nod and steepled his fingers. When he spoke, his voice was smooth. That should be everyone. Seems Lung won't be coming, though I doubt any of us are surprised, given the subject of tonight's discussion. The ABB, Kaiser replied. 35 individuals confirmed dead and over 100 hospitalized in this past week. Armed presence on the streets. Ongoing exchanges of gunfire between ABB members and the combined forces of the police and military. They have raided our businesses and bombed places where they think we might operating. They have seized our territories, and there's no indication they intend to stop anytime soon, Coyle clarified the situation for all present. It is inconvenient, Kaiser spoke. They're being reckless, Faultline said. She made it sound like that was a crime on par with killing kittens. Coyle nodded, which is the real concern. The ABB can't sustain this. Something will give, they will self-destruct sooner or later, and they will likely cease to be an issue. Had things played out differently, we could look at this as a good thing. Our problem is that the actions of the ABB are drawing attention to our fair city. Homeland Security and military forces are establishing a temporary presence to assist in maintaining order. Heroes are flocking to the city to support the Protectorate in regaining control of matters. It is making business difficult. Bakuda is at the center of this. Gru joined the dialogue. Lung may be the leader, but everything hinges on the girl. She recruited by orchestrating raids of people's homes while they slept, subduing them, and implanting bombs in their heads. She then used those bombs to coerce her victims into kidnapping more. No less than 300 in total now. Every single one of her soldiers knows that if they don't obey, Bakuda can detonate the bombs. All of them are willing to put their lives on the line, because the alternatives are either certain death or watching their loved ones die for their failure. Taking her down is our ultimate goal, but she's rigged her bombs to go off the second her heart stops, so it's a little more complicated than a simple assassination. He reached into the darkness that shrouded his chest and withdrew a package. She videotaped the ambush she pulled on my group a week ago and left it behind when she ran. I've made copies. Maybe you'll find it useful for getting a better understanding of her. Gru handed a burned CD to everyone at the table. This was our show of strength. The video showed everything from the point Bakuda had liquefied Park Ji-hoo to the second bomb she had set off in her ranks. As the second bomb had gone off in the midst of Bakuda's group, the camera had dropped briefly, recorded the sounds of guns going off and everything being darkened by Gru's power. But it didn't show us running. It didn't reveal our weaknesses, how lucky we'd been to get away, or how bad our circumstances had really been. It did let everyone know what we'd been up against, let them know that we'd come out fine and had been able to attend this meeting. That would do as much for our reputation as anything else. I wasn't 100% recovered from my concussion, and Alec was complaining of twinges in his arm, still. But Brian had stressed how important it was that we attend, give the illusion our team was intact, untouched. Seeing the other groups with their subtle posturing, I knew he'd been right. So, Coyle let the word hang in the air as he cracked each of the knuckles on his right hand individually. We're in agreement? The ABB cannot be allowed to continue operating. There were nods and murmurs of agreement from around the table, some from the various villains gathered around the room. Then I suggest we establish a truce. Not just everyone here, but between ourselves and the law. I would contact authorities and let them know that until this matter is cleared up, our groups will restrict our illegal activity to only what is absolutely essential to our business, and we will enforce the same for those doing business in our territories. That would let police forces and military focus entirely on the ABB. There would be no violence, infighting between our groups, grabs for territory, thefts, or insults. We band together with those we can tolerate for guaranteed victory, and we ignore those we cannot cooperate with. Just saying my group won't be getting directly involved in this without a reason, Faultline spoke. We won't be going after the ABB unless they get in my way or someone pays my rates. It's the only workable policy when you're a cape for hire. And just so we're clear, if it's the ABB paying, my team's going to be on the other side of things. Unfortunate, but you and I can talk after this meeting is done. I'd prefer to keep matters simple, Coyle said. You're okay with the other terms? Keeping on the down low, not kicking up a fuss with other groups? That's status quo with my group anyways. Good. Kaiser? I think that is acceptable, Kaiser agreed. I was talking to my group about doing something not too different from what Coyle just proposed, Gru spoke. Yeah, we're cool with it. Sure, Trickster said. Not a problem. We're in. Hands were shaken around the table. Funny, Tattletale murmured. I turned away from the scene to look at her. What? Aside from Gru and maybe Faultline, everyone's already plotting how they can use this situation to their advantage, or fuck over the others. I turned back to the scene, the villains sitting around the table. It dawned on me just how much sheer destructive potential was gathered in the room. This could get complicated. Arc 5, Hive, Part 2. Coyle addressed the room. Then that's our major piece of business concluded tonight. Anything else before we go our separate ways? Offers, announcements, grievances? I've got a complaint, a man at the side of the room spoke. Heads turned to Kaiser's group. Hookwolf. He wore a mask that was little more than a piece of sheet metal, cut and shaped to resemble a wolf's features, attached to his head with straps of black leather. He had a chain threaded through the belt loops of his jeans, sporting a heavy metal belt buckle. The buckle featured a wolf superimposed on a swastika, the same image he had tattooed on one of his biceps. The opposite arm simply had E88 on it. Outside of the mask and the belt buckle, you couldn't really say he had a costume. He was shirtless, shoeless, and hairy. His blonde hair was long and greasy, and he had thick hair on his chest, stomach, and arms. Harpoon-like spears and metal that curled like fishhooks radiated out from his shoulders, elbows, and knees, all bristling with barbs or wickedly serrated edges. Nobody, to date, had ever escaped the birdcage, the name that had been coined for the supervillain prison in British Columbia. Hookwolf, though, had escaped on no less than 2 occasions while being transported there. He was a killer and thought nothing of murdering people if they didn't fit the Aryan ideal. He turned to look at our table, very pale blue eyes visible through the slits in his metal mask. My complaints with her. What's the issue? Gru's voice was calm, but it looked like he was generating a bit more darkness around him than he had been, making himself look a fraction bigger. I wondered if he knew he was doing it. The crazy one, Hellhound, Bitch interrupted him. Only the panty-ass heroes call me Hellhound. It's bitch. Don't fucking care? Hookwolf growled. You attacked my business. Set your fucking dog on my customers. Lucky I wasn't there, whore. Gru gave bitch a long look, then he spoke to Hookwolf. That's the kind of risk you run doing business in Brockton Bay. Capes can and will get in your way, hero or villain. Hookwolf glared at him. It's a matter of respect. You want to fuck with my business and we're not at war? You let me know if you've got an issue first. Let me decide if I want to move shop. You mean give you a warning I'm coming? Bitch spat the words. That's the dumbest fucking thing I ever heard. Just so you know, moving to a different neighborhood won't be good enough. You open up another dogfighting ring, I'll be visiting that one too. Oh, that's what she'd done. I glanced at Tattletale, then at Gru. I was getting the impression neither of them had known. Kaiser spoke. Is that a declaration of war, Undersiders? We just agreed to a truce, if you recall. He was utterly calm, a stark contrast to Hookwolf. Hookwolf was brimming with barely suppressed rage to the point that I could picture him leaping across the room and attacking us if someone so much as dropped a glass. Gru shook his head. I think. I couldn't really tell with the way his darkness shrouded him, with his back turned to us. He answered, not interested in war, but I'm not going to stop my teammate from doing what she has to. You mean you can't stop your subordinate? Kaiser mused. Gru didn't have a quick response to that. I suspected he couldn't say. Bitch wasn't a subordinate without demoting himself in the eyes of the others at the table. Kaiser, Trickster, Faultline, and Coil were all leaders. Gru took a leadership role when needed, but he wasn't in charge of us. Not exactly. Gru clasped his hands in front of him, leaning forward with his elbows on the table. It's not so unusual for a cape to have a pet issue. You should know that as much as anyone. How would your people react if you forbid them from harassing or hurting gays, Kaiser? I wouldn't. Exactly. Same with her. Word gets around that you're someone who hurts dogs, she'll fuck you up. It's kind of common knowledge here. Not something I'd pay attention to. I'm more of a cat person. The sardonic comment elicited a few chuckles from the room. I think it's worth paying attention to if it leads to situations like this, Gru responded, his voice firm. I delegate to my underlings and trust them to keep track of minor details. Hookwolf has been out of town until recently. He must not have heard. The bullshit was so transparent, I couldn't help but wonder if he was baiting us. I'd like to resolve this peacefully, Gru reiterated. Kaiser shook his head with the sound of metal edges scraping on metal. Peace is always preferable. But I can't let an insult like this slide. We'll need restitution before this can be put to rest. Money or blood, your choice. Bitch made a sound low in her throat. She and Hookwolf weren't the only ones bristling. I looked at the table where Hookwolf sat with Fenja, Menja, Knight, Fogg, and Krieg, and everyone there looked visibly angry. Then let's sit on it until we're freer to give the matter our full attention, Gru spoke. The truce is in effect, and we'll meet again when things are more or less resolved with the ABB. He looked to the others at the table for confirmation. We will, Coil replied. Faultline nodded. What do you say? Gru asked Kaiser. Set this aside for now? Kaiser nodded once. Fair. We'll discuss the matter further at our next meeting. That's settled then. Anything else? Coil asked. Issues, negotiations, requests? There was no reply. Coil took that as answer enough. Then let's conclude the meeting. Thank you for attending. Faultline, could I have a word before you leave? There was the sound of chairs scraping against the floor as the people at the table got up. Faultline and Coil accepted. Skidmark's group headed out the door to leave right away, while Kaiser and Purity walked to the table where their underlings sat with their drinks. The travelers loitered around their table, not quite settling in, not leaving. Gru returned to us, but he didn't sit. Let's go. Nobody argued. We stood and left Summers Rock. Skidmark's group was taking their time leaving down one end of the street, so, unspoken, we headed in the other direction, just to be safe. There was no doubt those guys were spoiling for a fight. They were the diametrical opposite of Kaiser, Coil, and Faultline. Hot-headed, reckless, unpredictable. They would start a fight, even knowing they would set every other gang in the city against them for abusing neutral territory. We were a block away from the pub when Gru spoke. Bitch, do you understand why I'm pissed right now? Why we're pissed, Tattletale added. I guess. Gru paused as if he was choosing his words carefully. I want to be certain you know what you did wrong. Fuck you, she snapped. I get the idea. You don't have to get on my case. Gru glanced at the rest of us, then looked over his shoulder in the direction of the pub. We walked in grim silence past 3 different stores before he lashed out. He grabbed Bitch by the shoulder, then pulled her backward to break her stride, and put her off balance enough that she stumbled. Before she could regain her footing, he forced her bodily into the recessed area at the front of an old bookstore and shoved her against the door, his hand gripping her throat. I looked towards the pub. There was nobody leaving, and nobody looking our way. Biting my lip, I joined Tattletale and Regent in stepping inside the alcove. I was praying Gru knew what he was doing. For several long seconds, he just held her there, leaving her to claw for a grip on his arm and glove, kick ineffectually at his leg. Twice, as she looked like she had enough leverage to hit him harder, he used his grip on her throat to pull her forward and then shove her back against the door again, hard enough to give her coughing fits. She didn't stop fighting as he spoke, his quiet voice hollow with the effects of his power. I hate this, Rachel. That you make me do shit like this. That when I say things like that, I sound like everything I hate most in this world. But that's just the way you play things. It's the only time you're willing to listen. You hearing what I'm saying? Bitch jabbed at the center of his stomach, but he used the length of his arms to pull his body back enough to avoid the worst of the hit while still holding on to her throat. He slammed her against the door again. You hearing me, Rachel? She nodded sullenly, eyes darting in every direction, but directly at him. He eased up a fraction, and she was able to gasp in a few breaths. Look me in the eyes, he intoned. She did. His visor was just an inch from her face, and she couldn't actually see his eyes, but she stared steadily into the dark holes of his skull mask. I wasn't sure I could have, and he wasn't angry at me. You made me look bad. You made us look bad. I'm not pissed because of what you did to Hookwolf's business. That's you. That's your baggage, your shit. I get that it's par for the course with you on the team. I can live with that. You following? Another reluctant nod, not breaking eye contact. I peeked around the corner to make sure this conversation was still private. The travelers were outside the pub now, but they were taking their time leaving. Trickster was smoking a cigarette through the mouth hole of his mask. Gru went on, You know what you did wrong? You didn't fucking tell us. You let me fucking go in there and talk to those guys and get caught with my pants down. I had to fucking defend the actions of my team without knowing what the fuck people were talking about. It made me look weak. It made all of us look weak. You want an apology? Would you mean it? I haven't heard an honest apology from you since I met you. And believe me, an insincere apology from you would only piss me off more right now. So it's your call. You want to try? Bitch didn't answer. I could see her square her shoulders, straighten her head, a change of posture that was subtly challenging. Christ, Rachel, this is your second major fuck-up in the span of 2 weeks. Do I need to talk to the bossin? Stop, Tattletale cut in. My turn. Gru dropped his hand from Bitch's neck and stepped away, folding his arms as he turned his back to her. What had he been saying before Tattletale interrupted? Do I need to talk to the boss and see if we can replace you? If that was it, I could see why Tattletale had stepped in. You're frustrated, I get it, Tattletale spoke. Bitch was staring in the window of the bookstore, avoiding eye contact while she rubbed her neck. Tattletale went on, You don't feel like you did anything wrong, and if you had another chance to do things over, you feel like you'd do everything the same way, yet people are pissed at you. Bitch met Tattletale's eyes. Her tone was a combination of irritation and boredom. And people are taking turns chewing me out and spewing psychobabble shit at me. Tattletale waited, maybe to get her composure, to figure out another approach, or to use her power to dig for information she could use. Or maybe she was waiting to give Bitch time to think about how she wasn't helping herself any with what she was saying. I wasn't sure. I couldn't read her expression. She wasn't smiling or grinning like she usually did, though. Tattletale's tone was more exasperated as she replied, Fine, I'll cut right to the point. Both of your screw-ups this past week had to do with a lack of communication. If you'd called to let us know you were heading out to the money early, maybe we could have anticipated the ambush. If you let us know you'd messed with Hookwolf's dogfighting ring, we'd have been more prepared tonight. So open your mouth more. Talk to us. Let us know what's going on. All right? Bitch didn't respond, tension standing out on her neck, posture stiff, hands in her pockets. Think on it, Tattletale suggested. I checked around the corner again. Trickster was still smoking his cigarette, but he was looking directly at us. At me. The gorilla thing was too, but the others were looking at Trickster. I think he was talking. It was hard to tell. I think it's time to wrap this up, I informed the others. Eyes on us. We left the nook, with only Bitch's slumped posture giving any indication that anything had gone on. She trailed a few feet behind the rest of us. There was tension, and it wasn't all directed at or coming from her. Gru and Tattletale were walking slightly apart from one another. He either hadn't liked it when she cut in, or he was angry at himself. But something was bugging one or both of them. Regent had been quiet throughout. From what Lisa had said as she visited me earlier in the week, he was still getting twinges of pain from his arm. I suspected his current state was a combination of painkillers and a lack of a good night's sleep. He hadn't been a part of the recent dialogue, but his silence wasn't helping the mood any either. I didn't like this friction spoiling the camaraderie of the group, the undercurrent of tension. I liked these guys. Even bitch, I dunno. I supposed it would be a stretch to say I liked her, but I could maybe respect her for what she brought to the table. I knew it would be hard to turn on them, to pull off that grand betrayal and turn their information over to the Protectorate once I had the information I needed, but when I thought on it, I knew I could bite the bullet and do it. I would have less regrets in the long run. I could even be proud of it in the grand scheme of things, maybe. More and more, I was seeing the day I turned that information over and said goodbye to the Undersiders as the day I wanted to transform myself. Start transforming Skitter into a hero in the public eye, doing what I could to repair my image, and redefining Taylor into someone confident and outgoing and brave. If I could cut ties with the Undersiders and take that plunge, I knew I could change myself. But strange as it sounded, I would feel worse about handing their information to the Protectorate if this sort of negativity was what I was leaving behind when I did it. I knew it made no sense, but I wanted to be able to tell myself I'd had one successful set of friendships before I severed ties for the sake of doing the right thing. I could only hope that the sore feelings would fade. Even when I'd had friends, it had just been me and Emma. I didn't have enough experience to really know one way or the other as far as how groups of friends handled these sorts of sore feelings and resentment. It sucked. As I glanced back at Bitch, it struck me that this had to suck worse for her. I felt a twinge of sympathy. I knew what it felt like, to be the one alone in the midst of a group of people. Slowing my pace until I was walking beside her, I found myself struggling to find words. Make small talk? I wasn't sure how. Reassure her? I didn't think I could say anything without seeming like I was siding with her on things, or opening a can of worms as far as getting the argument going again. Adding my own voice to Gru's and Tattletale's would only make her feel worse, and I had my suspicions she wouldn't stand and take it from me the same way she had with the other two. Hook Wolf was running a dogfighting ring? I asked her, my voice lowered. Like, making dogs fight? Fight to the death? Bitch answered, almost inaudible. When your only real companions or family in the world were your dogs, I could see where that hit home. I'd never had a dog, but the way I saw things, dogs were like kids. They were at the mercy of specific people, and if those people decided to abuse that, it was just flat out wrong. You stopped them? She turned her head my way, met my eyes, made them bleed. I felt goosebumps prickle the back of my neck and my arms. I wasn't sure if I would feel better or worse if she decided to elaborate. Good, I replied. We didn't say anything more the rest of the way back. Probably for the best. Arc 5, Hive, Part 3. There was a long squeal of feedback, followed by the barely audible sound of a man clearing his throat. Attention shoppers. Please be informed that stores will be closing at 5:30 this evening, in cooperation with the citywide curfew. Make sure to cooperate with authorities at the entrances and exits of the Weymouth Shopping Center and return to your homes by 6 o'clock. Thank you. The crowd of people that had paused in their conversation and meandering to hear the announcement started moving and talking again, like someone had paused a video and had pressed the play button to get things started once more. I looked at my dad. Should we go? Beat the last-minute rush? Sure, if there's nothing else you need. I was due back at school tomorrow, and my dad had maybe sensed how stressed I was because he offered to take me shopping. It felt a little redundant after having been out with Lisa and the guys a week ago, but it did give me the chance to pick up some essentials and to spend some quality time with my dad. In the bags my dad was holding, I had a new backpack, some notebooks, pens, a half-dozen books, and a new pair of running shoes. The sort of stuff that I wouldn't have bought with Lisa, because they were so boring, like the notebooks, or because they were the sort of thing I took forever deciding on, like the books and shoes. All in all, the trip to the mall was a nice gesture, and it somehow meant more to me than Lisa treating me to a few $100s worth of clothes. Maybe because it was stuff for me. We made our way to the exit, and I had to hold back a groan. There was still over half an hour before the doors were due to close, but there was a crush of bodies at the exit. Maybe half were trying to leave, but the other half were gawking. Both inside and outside the glass doors of the mall's entrance, there were soldiers. Their guns were holstered, but they looked pretty intimidating anyways. In the midst of the soldiers were two capes, Battery and Shadow Stalker. I knew that members of the Protectorate, the wards, and various volunteers were stationed at places where there were groups of people, especially in areas in and around the ABB's territory. The wards, I supposed, were too young to handle a single location all by themselves, which was probably why Shadow Stalker was in a sidekick role here. I'd had a lot of time to watch the news as I was on bed rest. Bakuda was living up to what she'd been saying about maximizing fear and panic by combining unpredictability with grim certainty. Every day, there were reports of anywhere from 1 to 5 bombs going off. And while every single one was probably to the advantage of the ABB in some way, there was no way to tell what she'd hit next or why. One article online had surmised that as the military and superhero presence forced the ABB into a corner, the attacks would only escalate. Schools, malls, and office buildings were all potential targets. Justification enough for an armed presence here at the mall. The upside was that the mall had organized major sales in pretty much every store to keep business going. Maybe not the brightest or most logical thing, but too many businesses and employees were getting by on a day-to-day basis around here. Getting in had been like passing through airport security, getting our bags checked, showing ID. Nothing too bad. It had been only manpower from New Wave standing watch when we arrived, and there hadn't been much of a crowd. This was something more, two attractive, dangerous heroines, both with some controversy around them. As much as I could understand why the heroes were here, I could tell they were slowing things down as the rubberneckers got in the way of the people who were actually leaving. Half of the military presence that was inside the mall was busy working to keep the crowd back from the doors, and the two heroes in trying to organize people into lines. Progress through the line was slow, but I admit it was interesting to be able to watch Shadow Stalker and Battery going about their business from a safe perspective. Battery was a member of the Protectorate. When I'd been starting junior high, she'd been the head of the wards for a brief while, and she'd soon after graduated to the Protectorate. I could guess she was 22 or thereabouts now, if they didn't fudge the graduation date or anything to make it harder to guess the hero's real age. Her power let her charge up as she stood still and concentrated, with every second spent charging, giving her a few seconds of greatly enhanced speed, some extra strength, and some electromagnetic powers. Her costume was white and dark gray, with cobalt blue lines tracing it like you might see on a circuit board. Inquiries about whether her teammate Assault was her boyfriend or her brother had been met with coy deflections, leading a small fraction of the local superhero fans to surmise he was both. Anytime she did something in public, you could trust the online message boards to explode with speculation and theory. That soap opera paparazzi-style drama had never really grabbed my attention. Ignoring the vague possibly maybe chance there was something going on there, I thought she was the kind of hero I could look up to. She was nice, she worked hard, and in those inevitable situations where she found herself on TV with some asshole getting in her face about something, she handled things rather well. Battery leaned over to cup her hand over Shadow Stalker's ear and whisper something. Shadow Stalker nodded and then turned to walk through the glass door to say something to the soldiers stationed outside. Literally, through the door. As she did it, she turned a little smoky, like she was made of sand and not anything solid. It didn't seem constructive to me. In her shoes, I think I would have stuck to business as usual, without giving them more reason to stare. I would have used a door normally. Maybe I was biased. I kind of felt like I should dislike or hate her on principle, since she was Gru's self-declared nemesis. Lisa and Alec had explained how Shadow Stalker was a vigilante that agreed to join the wards rather than jail after going too far in the pursuit of justice. She was supposed to be using non-lethal weapons, but she wasn't. Capes always seemed so much bigger and impressive on the news. Once you looked past the dark gray urban camouflage hood and cape and the black painted metal of her mask, Shadowstalker was still just a teenage girl, only about as tall as me. Battery was only 2 or so inches taller than either Shadowstalker or myself, which meant she was still shorter than most of the men in the crowd. Now that I had been involved in cape stuff, I felt like I could look past the costume in a way most didn't. They looked normal, pretty much. Alan, my dad spoke. It's been a long time. I turned to look. I should have been surprised or shocked, but by the time I realized who we'd run into, I felt too deflated. It's good to see you, Danny. I've been meaning to get in touch. Not a problem, not a problem, my dad laughed easily. He shook the hand of the red-cheeked, red-haired man, Alan Barnes. These days, we can count it as a good thing if we're busy. Is your daughter here? Alan looked around. She was thirsty, so I'm holding our place in line while here she is. Emma joined us, a diet Sprite in one hand. She looked momentarily surprised as she saw me. Then she smiled. Hi, Taylor. I didn't reply. A few moments of awkward silence lingered. We need to get back in touch, Danny. Emma's dad smiled. Maybe you could come over for a barbecue sometime. When it's a little warmer, the weather will be perfect for it. I'd like that, my dad agreed. How's work? Better and worse. There's work to be had for the dock workers, with cleanup, reconstruction efforts, so that's good. And your projects? The ferry? I've resigned myself to waiting a few more months before I start making noise again. Mayoral elections are this coming summer, and there will be elections for the city council this fall. I'm hoping to see some fresh faces, people who won't dismiss some revival efforts as options. I wish you luck then. You know my firm is there if you need us. Appreciated. Emma turned her attention from idly watching the heroes and army at work to our dad's conversation. My dad saw her looking his way and decided to include her in the conversation. So, is Emma still modeling? She is. Alan smiled proudly, and doing quite well, but that's not why we're here today. We were just here for the sales. Alan chuckled a little. My daughter wouldn't let me relax the second she heard about it. Us too. Shopping, I mean. Taylor was caught at the edge of one of the explosions. Around the time this whole scene started, my dad answered. She's been home for a week recuperating. I thought we'd go shopping before she got back into the swing of things. Nothing serious in the way of injuries, I hope? Alan asked. I'm in one piece, I answered, not taking my eyes off Emma. That's good. My God, you're the third person I know who's been affected by this anarchy. One of my partners is in recovery from surgery. An explosion crystallized his arm, turned it to glass. Terrifying. Alan told my dad, when does this end? While our dads talked, Emma and I just stared at each other. Then Emma smiled. It was a look I'd seen so many times in the past few years. It was the smile that had greeted me when I came back to school from the hospital, back in January, that look that let me know she wasn't done. The same expression she'd had when she was looking down on me, covered in juice and cola in the stall of the school bathroom. The one she'd been wearing when I'd come out of the showers to find my clothes crammed in the toilets, both my gym clothes and regular ones. The same smile she'd had before she reminded me of how my mom had died, in front of everyone. The sound of the impact was like a splash of water in my face. I felt a twinge of pain from that gouge one of Bitch's dogs had made in my arm when I first met her, still sore. Emma fell over, bumping into her dad, who dropped the bags he was holding. There were gasps from the crowd around us. Taylor! My dad cried out, aghast. My hand was stinging, outstretched in front of me like I was reaching out to shake someone's hand. It took me a second to connect the dots. I'd hit her? Emma looked up at me, eyes wide, mouth open, one hand to the side of her face. I was as shocked at what I'd done as she was. Not that I felt bad. A large part of me wanted to laugh in her face. Weren't expecting that? Miscalculated how I'd react? Hands seized me with an iron grip and spun me around. Shadowstalker. She interposed herself between me and Emma. Dark brown eyes glowered at me from behind her mask. What was that for? Alan protested. Emma didn't even say anything. I'm so sorry. My dad hurried to explain to the superheroine and Emma's dad. She's still recovering from a concussion. It's affected her mood. I didn't expect anything this extreme. Shadowstalker scolded him. This is not the time or place for arguments. If your daughter is this unwell, then that's your responsibility. I felt like laughing. Part of it was just being giddy at doing something to get back at Emma. The other part was that this whole scenario was so ridiculously upside down. Shadowstalker wasn't really anything special. She was just a teenage girl, lecturing my dad, an adult. The crowd that was watching was seeing Emma as the victim, me as the bad guy. But if you stripped away the costume, if everyone knew the real story, this would all be playing out so differently. Emma would be the bad guy, and my dad wouldn't be so conciliatory about this girl telling him off. I had the presence of mind to not laugh aloud. Maybe it was the adrenaline, the relief that flowed from what I'd just done. Maybe it was the concussion, again, but I did find the conviction to do something else. I pointed at Emma, turned to my dad. You want to know why I hit her? Shadowstalker put one hand on the side of my face, forced me to look at her, stopping me from talking in the process. No, I'm stopping this right here. No arguments, no excuses as to why you just assaulted someone. We're breaking this up now. Turn around. What? I half laughed, incredulous. Why? Taylor, my dad said, looking drained. Do as she says. It didn't really matter because she forced me to turn around anyways, wrenching my arm until I did, then pulling my arms behind my back. Please, miss, my dad said, this isn't necessary. Shadowstalker bound my wrists with what I guessed was a plastic wrist tie. Too tight. Then she turned to my dad, and her voice was hushed. Look at this crowd. These people. They're scared. A place like this with this much suppressed panic, fear, and worry, this many people close together. I don't care if your daughter is an idiot or just ill. She's proven to be volatile in a powder keg situation. It's both dangerous and stupid to have her here. You can cut off the plasticuffs when she's separated from anyone she might harm. I'm not dangerous, I protested. Didn't look like it to me. Shadowstalker shook her head and gave me a push towards the exit. Go home and be grateful your dad isn't having to post bail for you to sleep in your own room tonight. My dad held his bags with one hand so he could help usher me toward the door. He looked over his shoulder at Alan. I'm very sorry, it's the concussion. Alan nodded, sympathetic. His ruddy cheeks were redder at the attention our scene had drawn. I know, it's all right. Just maybe she should stay home from school for a bit longer. My dad nodded, embarrassed. I felt bad at that. I felt worse at being led off like a criminal, while Shadowstalker gave Emma a hand to help her up. Emma was beaming, smiling one of the widest smiles I'd seen her give, despite the red mark on the side of her face. Smiling as much at the way things had turned out, I imagined, as she was at getting the chance to talk with the concerned superheroine. We headed out to the car, away from the crowd, the soldiers and Emma. I stood by the open passenger door for 2 minutes before my dad scrounged up some nail clippers to cut off the plasticuffs. I'm not mad, he told me, quietly after we'd settled in, as he started up the car and took us out of the parking garage. Okay, it's perfectly understandable. You're emotionally sensitive after getting knocked around by the explosion, and she reminds you of what's going on at school. More than you know, I muttered. I looked down at my hands, rubbed my wrists where the plastic tie had cut into them. If I didn't tell him now, I don't think I ever would. It's her, Emma. Oh, what? He sounded confused. I didn't have it in me to clarify matters. I just let him think it over. After a long pause, he just said, Oh, from the beginning. Her and her friends, I added, needlessly. Tears welled up, unexpected. I hadn't even realized I felt like crying. I raised my glasses to rub them away, but more came streaming out. Stupid head injury, I mumbled. Stupid mood swings. I'm supposed to be better by now. My dad shook his head. Taylor, kiddo, I don't think it's the only reason. He pulled over. What are you doing? I asked, wiping ineffectually at my cheek. We gotta be home before the curfew. He undid our seatbelts and pulled me into a hug, my face against his shoulder, my breath hitched with a sob. It's fine, he assured me. But we've got time. Take as long as you need. Arc 5, Hive. Part 4. A huge pet peeve of mine, being asked to arrive for a specific time, then being made to wait. 15 minutes was just about my limit of my patience. My dad and I had been waiting for more than 30 minutes. This has to be intentional, I complained. We'd been asked to wait in the principal's office a few minutes after we arrived, but the principal hadn't been around. Trying to show they're in a position of power, able to make us wait. My dad agreed. Maybe. Or we're just waiting for the other girl. I was at an angle where if I slouched in my chair just a bit, I could see the front of the office through a gap between the bottom of the blinds and the window. Not long after we'd arrived, Emma and her dad had showed up, looking totally casual and unstressed, like it was a regular day. She isn't even worried. Her dad was her physical opposite, beyond the red hair they shared. He was big in every sense of the word. Taller than average, big around the middle, and while he could speak softly when the situation called for it, he had a powerful voice that caught people's attention. Emma just had a biggish chest. Emma's dad was talking to Madison's mom and dad. Only Madison's mom was really petite like she was, but both her mom and dad looked really young. Unlike Emma and her dad, Madison and her parents did look concerned, and I was guessing that some of what Emma's dad was doing was reassuring them. Madison, in particular, was looking down at the ground and not really talking, except to respond to what Emma was saying. Sophia was the last to arrive. She looked sullen, angry, an expression that reminded me of bitch. The woman who accompanied her was most definitely not her mom. She was blonde and blue-eyed, had a heart-shaped face, and wore a navy blue blouse with khakis. The secretary came to get us from the office not long after. "Chin up, Taylor," my dad murmured as I slung my backpack over one shoulder. "Look confident, because this won't be easy. We may be in the right, but Alan's a partner in a law firm. He's a master manipulator of the system." I nodded. I was getting that impression already. After getting a phone call from my dad, Alan had been the one to call this meeting. We were directed down the hall to where the guidance counselor's offices were, a room with an egg-shaped conference table. The trio and their guardians were seated at one end of the table, 7 in total, and we were asked to sit at the other, the tip of the egg. The principal and my teachers all came into the room not long after, filling in the seats between us. Maybe I was reading too much into things after seeing an eerie echo of this situation just 2 days ago, with the meeting of villains. But I noted that Mr. Gladley sat next to Madison's dad, and the chair next to my dad was left empty. We would have been completely isolated from the mass of people at the other side of the table if Mrs. Knott, my homeroom teacher, hadn't sat at my left. I wondered if she would have, if there'd been another seat. I was nervous. I had told my dad that I'd missed classes. I hadn't told him how many, but I hadn't wanted to repeat Bitch's mistake and leave him totally in the dark. I was worried it would come up, worried this wouldn't go the way I hoped, worried I'd find some way to fuck it up. "Thank you all for coming," the principal spoke as she sat down, putting a thin folder down in front of her. She was a narrow woman, dirty blonde, with that severe bowl-cut haircut I could never understand the appeal of. She was dressed like she was attending a funeral. Black blouse, sweater and skirt, black shoes. "We're here to discuss incidents where one of our students has been victimized." She looked down at the folder she'd brought in. "Miss Habert?" "That's me." "And the individuals accused of misconduct are Emma Barnes, Madison Clements, and Sophia Hess. You've been in my office before, Sophia. I just wish it had more to do with the track and field team and less to do with detention." Sophia mumbled a reply that might have been agreement. "Now, if I'm to understand matters, Emma was attacked outside of school premises by Miss Hebert, and shortly after she was accused of bullying?" "Yes," Alan spoke. "Her father called me, confronted me, and I thought it best to take this to official channels." "That's probably best," the principal agreed. "Let's put this matter to rest." Then she turned to me and my dad, palms up. "What?" I asked. "Please, what charges would you lay against these 3? I laughed a little in disbelief. "Nice. So we're called here on short notice, without time to prepare, and I'm expected to be ready?" "Maybe outline some of the major incidents then. What about the minor ones?" I challenged her. "All of the little things that made my day-to-day so miserable. If you can't remember—" "I remember." I cut her off. I bent down to the backpack I'd set at my feet and retrieved a pile of paper. I had to flip through it for a few seconds before I could divide it into two piles. 6 vicious emails. Sophia pushed me down the stairs when I was near the bottom, making me drop my books, tripped and shoved me no less than 3 times during gym, and threw my clothes at me while I was in the shower after gym class had ended, getting them wet. I had to wear my gym clothes for the rest of the morning. In biology, Madison used every excuse she could to use the pencil sharpener or talk to the teacher, and each time she passed my desk, she pushed everything I had on my desk to the floor. I was watching for it the third time and covered my stuff when she approached. So on the fourth trip, she emptied the pencil sharpener into one of her hands and dumped the shavings onto my head and desk as she walked by. All 3 of them cornered me after school had ended and took my backpack from me, throwing it in the garbage. I see. The principal made a sympathetic face. Not very pleasant, is it? That's September 8th, I pointed out, my first day back at school, last semester. September 9th. Excuse me, sorry. How many entries do you have? One for pretty much every school day, starting last semester. Sorry, I only decided to keep track last summer. September 9th, other girls in my grade had been encouraged by those 3 to make fun of me. I was wearing the backpack they had been thrown in the trash, so every girl that was in on it was holding their nose or saying I smelled like garbage. It picked up steam, and by the end of the day, others had joined in on it. I had to change my email address after my inbox filled in just a day with more of the same sorts of things. I have every hateful email that was sent to me here, by the way. I put my hand on the second pile of papers. May I? Mrs. Knott asked. I handed her the emails. Eat glass and choke. Looking at you depresses me. Die in a fire, she recited as she turned pages. Let's not get sidetracked, my dad said. We'll get to everything in time. My daughter was speaking. I wasn't done with September 9th, I said. Let me find my place. Gym class again. Are you wanting to recount every single incident? The principal asked. I thought you'd want me to. You can't make a fair judgment until you hear everything that's happened. I'm afraid that looks like quite a bit, and some of us have jobs to get back to later this afternoon. Can you pare it down to the most relevant incidents? They're all relevant, I said. Maybe I'd raised my voice because my dad put his hand on my shoulder. I took a breath, then said, as calmly as I could, if it bothers you to have to listen to it all, imagine what it feels like to live through it. Maybe you'll get just a fraction of a % of an idea of what going to school with them felt like. I looked at the girls. Only Madison looked really upset. Sophia was glaring at me, and Emma managed to look bored, confident. I didn't like that. Alan spoke. I think we all grasp that it's been unpleasant. You've established that, and I thank you for the insight. But how many of those incidents can you prove? Were those emails sent from school computers? Very few school email addresses, mostly throwaway accounts from Hotmail and Yahoo, Mrs. Knott replied as she flipped through the pages. And for the few school email accounts that were used, we can't discount the chance that someone left their account logged in when they left the computer lab. She gave me an apologetic look. So the emails are off the table, Alan spoke. It's not your place to decide that, my dad answered. A lot of those emails were sent during school hours, I stressed. My heart was pounding. I even marked them out with blue highlighter. No, the principal spoke. I agree with Mr. Barnes. It's probably for the best that we focus our attention on what we can verify. We can't say who sent those emails and from where. All of my work, all of the hours I'd put in logging events when remembering the events of the day was the last thing I wanted to do, dash to the winds. I clenched my fists in my lap. You okay? My dad murmured in my ear. There was precious little I could actually verify, though. 2 weeks ago, Mr. Gladley approached me. I addressed the room. He verified that some things had occurred in his class. My desk had been vandalized with scribbles, juice, glue, trash, and other stuff on different days. Do you remember, Mr. Gladley? Mr. Gladley nodded. I do. And after class, do you remember seeing me in the hallway, surrounded by girls, being taunted? I remember seeing you in the hallway with the other girls, yes. If I remember, that was not long after you told me you wanted to handle things on your own. That is not what I said. I had to control myself to keep from shouting. I said I thought this situation here, with all the parents and teachers gathered, would be a farce. So far, you're not proving me wrong. Taylor, my dad spoke. He put his hand on one of my clenched fists, then addressed the faculty. Are you accusing my daughter of making up everything she's noted here? No, the principal spoke. But I think that when someone is being victimized, it's possible to embellish events or to see harassment when there is none. We want to ensure that these three girls get fair treatment. Do I started, but my dad squeezed my hand, and I shut up. My daughter deserves fair treatment too, and if even 1 in 10 of these events did occur, it speaks to an ongoing campaign of severe abuse. Does anyone disagree? Abuse is a strong word, Alan spoke. You still haven't proven. Alan, my dad interrupted him, please shut up. This isn't a courtroom. Everyone at this table knows what these girls did, and you can't force us to ignore it. Taylor ate dinner at your dining room table 100 times, and Emma did the same at ours. If you're implying Taylor is a liar, say it outright. I only think she's sensitive, especially after the death of her mother. I shoved the pile of paper off the table. There were 30 or 40 sheets, so it made a good-sized cloud of drifting papers. Don't go there. I spoke quiet. I could barely hear myself over the buzzing in my ears. Don't do that. Prove you're at least that human. I saw a smirk on Emma's face before she put her elbows on the table and hit it with her hands. In January, my daughter was subjected to one of the most malicious, disgusting pranks I have ever heard of, my dad told the principal, ignoring the papers that were still making their way to the floor. She wound up in the hospital. You looked me in the eye and promised me you would look after Taylor and keep an eye out. You obviously haven't. Mr. Quinlan, my math teacher, spoke. You have to understand, other things demand our attention. There's a gang presence in this school, and we deal with serious events like students bringing knives to class, drug use, and students suffering life-threatening injuries in fights on the campus. If we're not aware of certain events, it's hardly intentional. So my daughter's situation isn't serious. That's not what we're saying, the principal answered him, exasperated. Alan spoke. Let's cut to the chase. What would you two like to see happen here at this table that would have you walk away satisfied? My dad turned to me. We'd talked briefly on this. He'd said that as a spokesperson for his union, he always walked into a discussion with a goal in mind. We'd established ours. The ball was in my court. Transfer me to Arcadia High. There were a few looks of surprise. I expected you to suggest expulsion, the principal answered. Most would. Fuck no, I said. I pressed my fingers to my temples. Sorry for swearing. I'm going to be a little impulsive until I'm over this concussion. But no expulsion, because that just means they can apply to the next closest school, Arcadia, and because they aren't enrolled in school, it would mean accelerated entry past the waiting list. That's just rewarding them. Rewarding, the principal spoke. I think she was insulted. Good. Yeah, I said, not caring in the least about her pride. Arcadia's a good school. No gangs, no drugs. It has a budget. It has a reputation to maintain. If I were bullied there, I could go to the faculty and get help. None of that's true here. That's all you would want? Alan asked. I shook my head. No. If it were up to me, I'd want those three to have in-school suspension for the remaining 2 months of the semester. No privileges either. They wouldn't be allowed dances, access to school events, computers, or a spot on teams or clubs. Sophia's one of our best runners in track and field, the principal spoke. I really don't care, I replied. Sophia glared at me. Why in-school suspension? Mr. Gladley asked. It would mean someone would have to keep a constant eye on them. Would I have to take summer classes? Madison piped up. There would be remedial classes if we took that route, yes, the principal spoke. I think that's a little severe. As Mr. Gladley mentioned, it would require resources we don't have. Our staff is stretched thin as it is. Suspension's a vacation, I retorted, and it just means they could take a trip over to Arcadia and get revenge on me there. No, I'd rather they got no punishment at all than see them get suspended or expelled. That's an option, Alan joked. Shut up, Alan, my dad replied. To the rest of the table, he said, I don't see anything unrealistic about what my daughter is proposing. Of course you don't, Sophia's guardian spoke. You'd feel differently if the tables were turned. I feel it's important that Sophia continue to attend her track and field practices. The sports give her structure she needs. Denying her that would only lead to a decline in her behavior and conduct. Madison's dad added his own 2 cents. I think 2 months of suspension is too much. I'm forced to agree on all counts, the principal spoke. As my dad and I moved to protest, she raised her hands to stop us. Given the events that happened in January, and with Mr. Gladley's own admission that there's been incidents in his class, we know there's been some ongoing bullying. I'd like to think my years as an educator have given me some ability to recognize guilt when I see it, and I'm certain these girls are guilty of some of what the victim is accusing them of. I'm proposing a 2-week suspension. Weren't you listening to me? I asked. My fists were clenched so hard my hands were shaking. I'm not asking for a suspension. That's pretty much the last thing I want. I'm standing by my daughter in this, my dad spoke. I'd say 2 weeks was laughable, given this laundry list of criminal offenses these girls have committed, except there's nothing funny about this. Your list would mean something if you could back it up with evidence, Alan Riley commented, and if it wasn't all over the floor. I thought for a second that my dad would hit him. Any longer than 2 weeks would mean these girls' academics would suffer to the point they could fail the year, the principal stated. I don't think that's fair. And my schoolwork hasn't suffered because of them, I asked. The buzzing in my ears was reaching its limit. I realized belatedly that I'd just given her an opening to raise my missed classes. We're not saying it hasn't. The principal's tone was patient, as if she was talking to a small child. But eye for an eye justice doesn't do anyone any favors. She hadn't mentioned the classes. I wondered if she even knew. Is there any justice here? I replied. I'm not seeing it. They're being punished for their misconduct. I had to stop to willfully push the bugs away. I think they were reacting to my stress, or my concussion was making me a little less aware of what I was doing with them, because they were pressing in without my giving them the order. None had entered the school or the conference room, thankfully, but I was getting increasingly worried that my control would slip. If it did, instead of sort of wandering in my general direction or gravitating towards my location, the bugs would erupt into a full-fledged swarm. I took a deep breath. Whatever, I said. You know what? Fine. Let them get away with a 2-week vacation as a reward for what they did to me. Maybe if their parents have an ounce of heart or responsibility, they'll find an appropriate punishment. I don't care. Just transfer me to Arcadia. Let me walk away from this. That's not really something I can do, the principal said. There's jurisdictions. Try, I pleaded. Pull some strings, call in favors, talk to friends in other faculties. I don't want to make any promises I can't keep, she said, which meant no. I stood up. Taylor, my dad put his hand on my arm. We're not the enemy, the principal spoke. No? I laughed a little, bitter. That's funny, because it looks like it's you guys, the bullies and the other parents against me and my dad. How many times have you called me by my name today? None. Do you even know why? It's a trick lawyers use. They call their client by name, but they refer to the other guy as the victim or the offender, depending. Makes your client more identifiable, dehumanizes the other side. He started doing it right off the bat, maybe even before this meeting started, and you unconsciously bought into it. You're being paranoid, the principal spoke. Taylor, I'm sure I've said your name. Fuck you, I snapped. You disgust me. You're a deluded, slimy, self-serving. Taylor? My dad pulled on my arm. Stop. I had to concentrate a second and direct the bugs to go away again. Maybe I'll bring a weapon to school, I said, glaring at them. If I threatened to stab one of those girls, would you at least expel me? Please? I could see Emma's eyes widen at that. Good. Maybe she'd hesitate before hassling me again. Taylor, my dad spoke. He stood up and pulled me into a tight hug, my face against his chest so I couldn't say any more. Do I need to call the cops? I heard Alan. For the last time, Alan. Shut up, my dad growled. My daughter is right. This has been a joke. I have a friend in the media. I think I'm going to give her a call, email her that list of emails and the list of incidents. Maybe pressure from the public would get things done. I hope it doesn't come to that, Danny, Alan replied. If you recall, your daughter assaulted and battered Emma just last night. That's in addition to threatening her here. We could press charges. I do have the surveillance video from the mall and a signed slip from that teenage superheroine, Shadow Stalker, that verifies she saw it happen in what could have provoked a riot. Oh, so that was why Emma had been so confident. She and her dad had an ace up their sleeve. There's mitigating circumstances, my dad protested. She has a concussion. She was provoked. She only hit Emma once. The charges wouldn't stick. No, but the case could drag out for some time. When our families used to have dinner together, you remember me saying how most cases were resolved? Decided by who ran out of money first, my dad said. I felt him clutch me a fraction tighter. I may be a divorce attorney, but the same applies in a criminal case. If we went to the media, he'd press assault charges just to drain our bank accounts. I thought we were friends, Alan, my dad replied, his voice strained. We were, but at the end of the day, I have to protect my daughter. I looked at my teachers. At Mrs. Knott, who I'd even say was my favorite teacher. Don't you see how fucked up this is? He's blackmailing us right in front of you, and you can't understand that this manipulation has been going on from the beginning? Mrs. Knott frowned. I don't like the sound of it, but we can only comment and act on what happens in school. It's happening right here. You know what I mean. I pulled away. In my haste to get out of that room, I practically kicked down the door. My dad caught up to me in the hallway. I'm sorry, he said. Whatever, I said. I'm so not surprised. Let's go home. I shook my head, turning away. No, I need to get going. I won't be home for dinner. Stop. I paused. I want you to know I love you. This is far from over, and I'll be waiting for you when you come home. Don't give up, and don't do anything reckless. I hugged my arms close to my body to get the shaking in my hands to stop. Kay. I left him behind and headed out the front door of the school. Double-checking he hadn't followed and that he couldn't see me, I retrieved one of the disposable cell phones from the front pocket of my sweatshirt. Lisa picked up partway through the first ring. She always did. One of her little quirks. Hey, how did it go? I couldn't find the words for a reply. That bad? Yeah. What do you need? I want to hit someone. We're gearing up for a raid on the ABB. We didn't bother you about it because you're still recovering, and I knew you'd be busy with your meeting at school. Want in? Yeah. Good. We're splitting up for a bunch of coordinated attacks with some of the other groups. You'd be with, 1 second. She said something, but it wasn't directed at the phone. I heard the bass of Brian replying. Every team is splitting up. Bit complicated to explain, but yeah. Bitch would be going with 1 or 2 members of the Travelers, some of Fault Line's crew, and probably some of Empire 88. It would do a lot for our peace of mind if you went with. Especially with the tension between us and the Empire. I could see the bus at the far end of the street approaching. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Arc 5, Hive, Part 5. Time was short, so Tattletale was in my room of the loft while I changed. The idea Coyle proposed was that we would mix and match the members of the groups so nobody can pull anything without their teammates being hostage to the other groups. Gotcha, I replied. I busied myself double-checking the items from the utility compartment. Tattletale reached in and snatched the cell phone. Hey? 1 sec. I'm programming the alarm on your phone. When it goes off, an hour from now, you call Gru. Then again an hour later, if we're out that long. We'll all be checking in with each other every 15 minutes or so. If someone doesn't pick up, assume they're in trouble. Okay, I agreed. If you can't pick up the phone for whatever reason, be sure to call back at the first opportunity. Let us know you're fine. Got it. I hiked the cloth portion of my armor up around my waist, then began sliding my arms through the sleeves. The cloth part was form-fitting, and all in all, putting it on was like putting on a pair of full-body pantyhose. Not prone to tear, of course, but like the pantyhose, it always took longer than I expected. We'll be using a password system every time we check in case you're taken hostage and forced to answer a call. 2 parts to it. The first part is simple. You give the other person the first letter of one of our names. The other person replies with the last. If it winds up being a longer night, move on to other people we know. So if I said L, A, how would you respond to B? N. Exactly. The second part is color-based. When you're replying to a call, name an object that's a certain color. Think traffic lights. Green for go, everything is okay. Yellow for warning, if you aren't sure about things. Red for stop, need help. It lets you keep us informed without tipping off the capes that are with you. Okay. I'm going with the group that has Fault Line, Trickster, and the Traveler's Shapeshifter. I'm betting there will be a few from Empire 88 and some of Coil's soldiers too. Shapeshifter? That gorilla with 4 arms from the other night. Only I don't know exactly what she is yet, but she's not quite a shapeshifter. I'm hoping to get a better sense of her abilities by spending some time around her. Ditto for Trickster. Regent's coming with, so we're contributing some firepower, kind of. Don't you and Faultline have issues with each other? Lisa grinned. Yup, it's going to be fun, pushing her buttons knowing she can't touch me. I winced. Just be careful. What's Gru doing? Another group. All in all, we'll be coordinating to strike 3 locations simultaneously with 3 different teams, overwhelming force. Hit hard, hit fast, get out of there. If you aren't making much of a dent, don't sweat it. Unless something goes horribly wrong, we'll repeat this process a few more times over the next couple of days. There was a knock on the door. Brian called from the other side. Just about ready? I zipped up the back of my costume and strapped my armor in place over it, then opened the door, mask in one hand, ready. Brian, like me, was costumed but didn't have any headgear on. You sure you're up to this? You're recovered from the knock you took to the head? No, I admitted, not entirely, but I'm pissed and I think I'll be less okay in the long run if I don't go out and vent somehow. He paused as if he were thinking things over. Okay, you going to be all right dealing with bitch on your own? I frowned. I'll manage somehow. Don't show her any weakness, or she won't let up on you. I figured as much, I agreed. As we headed for the stairs, I mused that maybe bitch and I were more on the same page today. I was pissed at life in general, feeling just a bit off kilter in a way that wasn't 100% the concussion. I pulled on my mask as we headed outside. There was a nondescript van pulled over in front of the door, blocking line of sight to the rest of the street. Bitch and Regent were already inside, waiting. Hey, dork, Regent greeted me. He was in costume, typical except for the shirt he was wearing. Other nights it had been white, but it was a dark gray today. It was still the same slightly elaborate, puffy Renaissance fair style of clothing, though. You can call me Skitter. I won't mind. That's all right, he answered. There was a note of humor in his voice, which I took to mean he was just having fun at my expense. I resolved to ignore him. Bitch just stared angrily at me. It was so intense I had to look away. So much for being on the same page. The interior of the van had benches on either side. Since we were in a rush, I had only a second to decide whether I wanted to sit next to Regent and be facing bitch for the duration of the trip, or plop myself down next to her and the dogs. I opted for the former, hoping I wouldn't manage to do or say anything that would get us off on a bad start for the evening. Tattletale sat in the passenger seat, with Gru driving. As the van pulled onto the road, she called back to us. Hey, bitch, Skitter. We're dropping you off first, but you're going to have to walk to the meeting place. You might be short on time, so walk fast. Cool? Bitch shrugged. Works. No complaints. I added my own 2 cents. I could see where it would be advantageous. Bitch would have time to get her dogs beefed up, and I could gather some bugs. Besides, it gave us something to do. If we had to stand idle for a few minutes, I was pretty sure it would only increase the chances of bitch finding a reason to pick a fight with me or one of the other villains. Remembering my bugs, I took a few seconds to extend my powers outward and begin gathering them. I was surprised at how far my reach was extending. I generally measured things in city blocks. I've never been good at eyeballing distance, and I would say my range usually sat at around 2 blocks. Today I was reaching just shy of 3.5. Hey, Tattletale, I asked. Sup? 2 questions. Go for it. What general direction is the spot you're dropping me off? Need to know where to send the bugs. Northwest. I glanced out the tinted windows of the van to judge which direction we were going, then began giving commands to the bugs that fell within my reach. Second question. My power's a fair bit stronger today. Not sure about technique, but I'm extending a lot further. Any idea why? Can't say. Sorry, I could usually try to figure it out, but I'm focusing on other things right now. If you think it's really crucial. No, I stopped her. It's not. I'll bug you about it later, when your attention isn't divided. Pun intended, Regent mused. What? Guess not. Never mind, he chuckled a little. Bitch was using her power on her dogs. It was really my first opportunity seeing it happen from the beginning. It was like seeing a sausage split its casing, only the casing was fur and skin. Where the rifts appeared, it wasn't just muscles spilling out, but spears and ridges of bone. Some of the exposed muscle shriveled into scaly growths. Yet they kept growing, to the point the back of the van was feeling crowded. Where did that mass come from? Was it pulled out of thin air, or was she drawing in some kind of energy and converting it into matter? For that matter, if my brain was a radio tower of sorts, pinging every bug for their locations on a near constant basis and sending them instructions to override their own brains, where was the energy to keep that up coming from? It was a little disconcerting to think about. When Gru stopped the van to let us out, I realized why we were walking. Our stop was a bridge with bus stations on either side. Problem was, it seemed the ABB had decided to cut off this route. The bridge had been reduced to rubble. Large orange and black detour signs with blinking lights barred entry to the shattered bridge, and similar measures had been used to cordon off the piles of rubble below. Tattletale leaned out the open window and pointed. See that tower there? Looks like a lighthouse. It's an old tourist shop that closed down a decade ago. It's where the merchants, Skidmark and his crew of dealers, hung out before the ABB expanded and forced them out. You're supposed to meet the others there. I looked and saw the building she was pointing at. It didn't look much like a lighthouse, but whatever. Gotcha. Go, Brian said. Good luck. Bitch whistled for her dogs and we headed for the stairs. We'd have to head down across the street and back up to get where we needed to be. It was weird, picking our way through the rubble of the destroyed bridge to cross the street. You didn't usually cross the road like this, and the streets were deserted here. The dogs seemed to like the experience, though. I saw Judas's tail wagging as he hopped from one slab of road to another. I pulled open the door with shattered glass panes that led to the other set of stairs, letting Bitch and the dogs through. As she passed me, Bitch murmured, "You're angry." "Yeah," I admitted. "Bunch of stuff earlier this afternoon. Didn't go the way I wanted. Assholes. Should hit 'em. Teach them to fuck with you." "I did," I answered. "Knocked one of them on her ass last night. Part of the reason things didn't go so hot today." Story of my life. We headed up the stairs and towards the lighthouse. My bugs were starting to accumulate. Our detour had given the flying bugs time to catch up to me. Wasps, moths, houseflies, no-see-ums, a few bees, and a fair few cockroaches. I'd learned my lesson on our last outing. I wasn't going in unprepared and unarmed. As they arrived, I drew the bugs close. Selecting the best of them, I directed them under my armor, in the hollow space beneath my shoulder pads, under my belt, my elbows and wrist guards, in my hair, and the concave panel of armor that covered my spine. They were there if I needed them. I doubted anyone would notice unless I let them. "How'd you know I was angry?" I asked. "Dunno. Look that way." "Yeah, but you can't see my face." "Way you're standing, I guess. You going to get on my case about this?" "No, sorry," I answered. I decided to keep quiet for the rest of our trip to the lighthouse. Interestingly, she almost seemed to relax as the silence lingered. Her face lost that slightly angry expression, and she reached over to scratch Brutus on the side of his neck in what seemed a very normal, casual gesture for someone I viewed as anything but. Or at least it would have been normal and casual if the dogs weren't currently the size of small ponies. We reached the lighthouse, and sure enough, there was a group of villains waiting. Kaiser was first and foremost among them. He was decked out head to toe in elaborate, ornate armor with a crown of blades, but the configuration, I noticed with interest, was totally different than it had been just 2 days ago. Fenja and Menja stood at either side of him. Only one of the travelers was accompanying our group. The girl with the sun design on her costume, red suns on black form-fitting armor. Just behind her were 2 members of Faultline's crew. Neuter was hanging off the wall by his fingertips and toes, and Labyrinth was leaning against the same wall just below him, her arms folded. Neuter was wearing tattered jeans and had dyed his hair a cobalt blue, setting off the orange of his skin. He had cloth wrap, like you'd see a kickboxer use, wrapped around his hands and feet. Rounding out our group were two men in matching Kevlar armor, with balaclavas, visors, and tricked-out assault rifles. Each of the men had a second gun slung over their back. I thought one was another rifle, but I didn't have a good view of the other. I might have pegged it a grenade launcher. Coyle's men, probably. Fenja or Menja. I wasn't sure which. Leaned over and whispered in Kaiser's ear. "Arrived with less than a minute to spare, Undersiders," he purred. "Watches out, everyone." I paused. I hadn't brought one. Then I remembered the cell phone. I retrieved it from the compartment, the cluster of bugs I had in there moving automatically out of the way of my hands. If anything, they made it easier to know where my fingers should reach to grab it. Set time to 4:40 in 3, 2, 1, set. The attack is scheduled to start in 5 minutes. We'll use the time to get there, get in position, and decide our method of attack. Nobody argued. "Move out," he directed us. Bitch turned her attention to Brutus, who made a groaning noise as he suddenly swelled. Splits appeared in his skin as he grew another 2 or 3 feet taller at the shoulder, and spikes of bone erupted from his exterior. He stretched, then shook abruptly, spraying all of us with the bloody aftermath of his sudden growth. There were reactions of alarm and startled shouts from everyone present, with the exception of myself, Bitch and Labyrinth. Kaiser, surprisingly, was among them, backing away several steps before he realized Brutus wasn't attacking. There was a bit of swagger in her posture as Bitch walked the 2 steps to where Brutus stood, grabbed a spike of bone, and hauled herself onto his back. It was intentional, maybe a bit immature, but she'd made Kaiser flinch. Taking him down a notch like that, so soon after he'd assumed control of this impromptu team, it was probably more of a statement than anyone present could have accomplished with words. As if to drive the point home, she gave Brutus a light kick in the ribs, prompting him to walk in the direction Kaiser had indicated. Judas, Angelica, and I were right behind her. I didn't turn to see how long it took the others to pull themselves together and follow. Arc 5, Hive, Part 6. However effective Bitch's power play might have been, it didn't do much to help the tension between the factions making up our group. It hadn't been just Kaiser that got spooked and sprayed with blood. Worst case scenario, if a fight broke out in the group, I was worried that hard feelings from that one thing could set others against us. I decided to try to remedy that. The Travelers seemed to be the only group present where there wasn't some drama already mucking the waters. "Hey," I slowed my pace so I could talk to the girl from the Travelers. "What's your name?" "My code name?" "Yeah, Sundancer. I'm going by Skitter. Couldn't decide on a name, so the media sort of picked one for me." "You're one of the outsiders, right?" "Undersiders. I'm new to the team, honestly, but they're all right." "Uh-huh." She looked in Bitch's direction. "Not as bad as you'd think," I said, smiling. She couldn't see me smile, with my mask covering my mouth, but I did hope she could hear the humor in my tone. "How's life among the Travelers?" She seemed caught off guard at the question. It took her a few seconds to decide how to respond. "Intense, violent, lonely." The answer surprised me. She chose the word intense rather than exciting, but that wasn't the strangest part of her answer. "Lonely? I wouldn't think that was the case, spending time with teammates." She shrugged. "There's stuff going on that makes hanging out less fun than it should be. I'm not going to explain it, so don't ask." I raised my hands, palms up, stopping her. "Wasn't going to. I was just curious what it's like for other teams since I'm fairly new to this." She relaxed a bit at that. "It's not just that I can't think of a word better than drama, but drama sounds like such an understatement. Whatever. It's not the other stuff that's going on. It's that we're constantly moving, rarely spending more than a week in one place, you know?" "I don't," I admitted. I fudged the truth a little, just to be safe. I moved twice as a kid, but I was too young to remember it. For the most part, I grew up here. It gets old having two. She stopped talking as I was suddenly pushed to one side. The tip of Neuter's tail pressed against the center of my chest and moved me back, pushed me against the hood of a dilapidated old car. "Hey," I grunted, but he shook his head, pressed a finger to his lip. His blue eyes bored into mine. They were weird eyes. No whites, just azure blue irises that extended from corner to corner with rectangular horizontal pupils. I looked at the others, and they were all moving into cover. Kaiser, Fenja, and Menja had all ducked into an alleyway. Bitch and her dogs were disappearing around the far corner of the same building, making only the scratching noise of claws against concrete. Ahead of us, a trio of people in ABB colors crossed the street. A guy and a girl who looked like they might have been gang members before Bakuda's hardcore recruitment drive were talking. A teen who was about my age trailed behind them, looking too scared and worn out to be anything but one of the new recruits. They were all armed. A machete dangled from the male thug's hand, while the girl was toying with a handgun. The scared-looking kid had a baseball bat with nails hammered into it. People really did that? The nail-studded baseball bat? Just behind them was the building that had to be our target. It was a warehouse, dirty gray, with the letters ABB spray-painted on and around the loading bay door in red and green in an elaborate style. When the patrol was gone, Neuter spoke. "They've got patrols, and they've tagged the building. That'll be our target today." He checked his watch, 2 minutes until it's time to move. "My girls and I will circle around," Kaiser stated from the cover of the alleyway. "Attack from another direction." "Hey, no," I replied. "That's not the deal. We're in groups like this for a reason, and that reason flies out the window if we split up like that." "I didn't ask your permission," Kaiser replied, his voice cool. Without waiting for a response, he turned to leave, Fenja and Menja following him. "Are we going to stop them?" I asked. "I could catch up to them," Bitch told us, as she rode Brutus back towards our group. Neuter shook his head, thin lips pressed into a line that only accented his strange appearance. "Not worth it, and dangerous to fight amongst ourselves in enemy territory. We don't have time anyways." "Bitch, can you call Gru and Tattletale? Let them know?" I asked. "They can take measures if they need to." She nodded and got her cell phone out. While Bitch made the call, Neuter beckoned the others to gather in a huddle. "Let's talk plan of attack. Skid or Bitch, you two have the most experience dealing with these guys, so start us off." I glanced at Bitch. She was busy with the call, and she had been out of action during our last encounter with the ABB, which left her kind of in the dark as far as Bakuda went. It was up to me. I silently cleared my throat, then I spoke up. "Bakuda likes to set traps, and if this place is important enough to patrol, it's important enough to have some traps. Let me send my bugs in first. I can get the lay of the land, and the bugs will also confuse and distract anyone inside, which should make things easier on you guys." Neuter nodded once. "Okay. That's step one. Bitch, can you and your dogs hit the ground floor? I'll go in the second floor window." Bitch gave him a curt nod in response. "The bugs won't bite her?" Neuter asked. "No," I answered. "Won't bite you either." "They couldn't if they tried," Neuter answered me, smiling. Funny if you look past the odd appearance. The blue hair, the weird eyes, the orange skin and the tail, he was actually a pretty good-looking guy. "Sundancer, what can you do?" Neuter asked. "I guess you could say I'm artillery," Sundancer replied. "But I've got the same problem Ballistic does. My other teammate. I'm not sure I can use my power without hurting a lot of people really badly." "Then stay back with Labyrinth. You two be ready to cover our retreat or move in if we run into trouble," Neuter replied. "Sounds like you know what you're doing," I commented. "Maybe some of Faultline has rubbed off on me." He smiled. Then he glanced at his watch. 20 seconds. Neuter glanced at the two soldiers Coyle had sent. "You two, can you? We're taking a position on this rooftop here," the shorter of the two men replied, pointing up to the 2-story duplex next to us. "We'll support you with cover fire." Good. Try not to kill anyone," Neuter said, checking his watch again. 5 seconds. "Skidder? Start us off?" I reached out to all the bugs I'd gathered, minus the ones I was keeping beneath my costume. I directed them towards the side of the building we were facing. The swarm swept in through windows that were open or broken, and the one open door on the side of the building flowing into the hallways. I made sure to spread them out to cover every surface, feeling for anything that was out of place or unusual. There were a fair number of people inside, which wasn't a huge surprise, but my bugs were making a lot of contact with bare skin. I realized the people gathered in the open area of the warehouse's ground floor were nearly naked, stripped down to their underwear. It was so unexpected that it threw me off my stride. I shook my head. I couldn't afford to get distracted. Bakuda probably used metals and plastics, and to the superfine senses of the bugs, that was an entirely different texture from the walls. I tried to filter out the usual stuff and get a feel for just the plastic or metal things. Just a few feet in from the entrance, I found two dome-shaped bulges on either side of the stairwell that led to the second floor, metal and plastic. "There's something there," I said. "Give me a second." I took a page out of Gru's playbook and gathered a group of bugs together into a densely packed, vaguely humanoid shape. I moved that collection of bugs through the doors and to the place where the little domes sat. The explosion blew a fair-sized chunk out of the exterior wall of the building closest to us. The people inside, already nervous at the influx of bugs, started scattering, screaming, running for the exits. "Holy shit!" Neuter's eyes went wide. "Motion detectors, I think," I said. "Or proximity activated. My bugs wouldn't normally set them off, had to fool them." The ground was too hard for landmines, so I focused on having the remainder of the bugs sweep through the rest of the building, skimming the surfaces and looking for more trouble. I found two more, checked nobody was near, and used the same method to detonate them. The plumes of flame, smoke, and debris were visible from where we crouched. 20 or 30 people on the ground floor, unarmed and half naked, 10 in upstairs office, armed, I said. "Route is as clear of traps as I can get it. Go." Bitch lunged into action, Neuter only a few steps behind. He half ran, half crawled, his tail whipping around behind him, presumably to help keep his balance. As Bitch had her dogs crash into and through the closed metal loading bay door, Neuter intercepted the first few people to leave through the fire exit door on the side of the building. He leaped to close 15-foot gaps as fast as I could have thrown a punch, moving from one person to the next, dropping each of them in an instant. Lots of women in that group, and I could confirm with my eyes what my bugs had told me. 9 out of 10 of the people in that group, a mix of Asian men and women, were only wearing their underwear. Slave trafficking? Prostitution? Something darker? I felt my skin crawl. As he darted up the side of the building and slipped into an open window like a bolt of greased lightning, I felt Neuter brush past several with my bugs. Each bug that came into contact with him dropped off the wall or out of the sky, falling to the ground, alive but stunned. I remembered reading about him on the web. Information had been scarce, since Faultline's crew weren't the types of villain to appear in the papers or on TV, and the concrete details that were out there had been hard to pick apart from the speculation. What I did know was that his bodily fluids were potent hallucinogens. Even the sweat that accumulated on his skin was apparently enough to send someone off to La La Land, taking only a few seconds for it to be absorbed through the skin. I focused my attention on tracking what was happening inside the building. Neuter was on the second floor, probably dodging gunfire as he moved closer to the group of people who had been in the upstairs office. I had my bugs cluster around them, biting their hands and faces. I sent them crawling into noses, ears, and mouths to disrupt the aim of the people who might shoot Neuter. Kaiser, Fenja, and Menja were attacking from the side of the building opposite us. They had drawn the attention of most of the armed agents and patrols, leaving Bitch and her dogs stranded in the midst of 1 or 2 dozen unarmed, unclothed, panicked people. From what my bugs were sensing, she was giving lots of commands to her dogs. I realized, belatedly, that someone had blocked off the route Bitch might have taken to reach the fighting. The edges of the offending barrier were thin, sharp. Blades? That meant Kaiser would be the one who had blocked her. Was it intentional, or had he been cutting off the ABB's escape routes? I couldn't sense what Neuter was doing, since my bugs couldn't touch him, but I could feel the movement of the air that followed in his wake. I could track the locations of the bugs he came into contact with before they were brought down by the drugs, and I knew the men were collapsing as Neuter moved into their midst and knocked each of them out with a touch. 1 or 2 even collapsed without him touching them. Something else? Blood? Spit? Only one remained standing. He and Neuter circled one another, My bugs weren't having much effect on him since he was wearing a bandana or something over his face. No, wait, there was a second person, just behind Neuter. How had I not noticed him? Then the first disappeared, and I knew. I grabbed my phone, accessed the contacts, and auto-dialed bitch. Come on, answer, answer, I whispered at the phone. Then a handful of my bugs were stunned, and a few more squashed as Neuter collapsed on top of them. I directed most of the bugs in the building to distract the attacker, hoping to buy Neuter enough time to get away. It wasn't working. He wasn't moving. Fuck! Answer, bitch! What's wrong? Sundancer asked. Neuter's hurt. Labyrinth put her hand on my shoulder, half spun me to face her. She didn't say a word. Her expression barely changed behind the cloth of her mask, but it was still the closest I'd seen to an emotional response from her. I would have said something, but Bitch chose that same second to pick up. Bitch, second floor, Neuter's wounded. Oni Lee is in the building. There was a long pause before she replied. Lung's here too. Arc 5, Hive, Part 7. Lung's there, I echoed, as much to let Sundancer and Labyrinth know as to help myself process the idea. He's with Kaiser. I can't get to them. Kaiser blocked the door with giant knives. Ignore Lung, I stressed. If Kaiser wanted to go it alone, he could reap the consequences. Priorities are Neuter and Oni Lee. Can you get upstairs to rescue Neuter? I can't ride Brutus in there. I'd have to dismount. Then draw him outside. Watch your back. I hung up, shoved the phone into the compartment behind my back, and drew my baton and knife. What are you doing? Sundancer asked. Oni Lee's a freaking assassin. I can't leave Bitch on her own. I didn't wait another second. I bolted for the warehouse, drawing more bugs from the surroundings to help back me up. Bitch, still riding Brutus, came rushing out the loading bay door, Judas only a step behind. They skidded to a stop, facing the building. Through the hole the explosion had made in the wall, I saw Angelica climbing up the stairs. As Angelica reached the top of the stairs, Judas lunged up and through the windows at the opposite end of the second-floor hallway, trapping Oni Lee in between them. Oni Lee barely seemed to care. I could see him in his black bodysuit with belts and bandoliers of knives on it, his mask with the demonic face and leering, fanged, ear-to-ear grin. He glanced at one dog, then the other, then looked out the window. I knew his power was a hybrid between duplicating himself and teleportation. He could teleport, but when he did, he left a body behind that could act autonomously for a few seconds. So when I saw him glance out the window, I followed his line of sight and saw he had already appeared just behind Bitch, half crouching on Brutus's back, one hand on a hook of bone to help him balance. There was a flash of steel in his other hand as he reached around her throat with a blade. Bitch, I screamed. It didn't matter. At the same time as I opened my mouth, a red dot and a mist of red appeared out of the back of his head. A split second later, another dot and spray of red appeared on his back, around his heart was. He fell on top of Bitch's shoulder, limp, then collapsed to the ground. A second later, he exploded into an opaque cloud of white ash 10 feet across. I glanced over my shoulder, saw the dark silhouettes of Coil's men lying down on the edge of the rooftop. One had a pair of binoculars. The other was set up behind a long rifle with a prominent scope. A sniper team. Anyone else would be dead by now, but the fact that the body had exploded into dust meant it was just a clone, a leftover remaining behind after Oni Lee had teleported away. He probably wasn't remaining in one place for more than a second. My bet was that he was appearing, immediately looking for a new target or vantage point, then making a quick exit, leaving the clone to do the deed. I reached Bitch and cast a nervous glance over my shoulder for Oni Lee. You okay? Felt the fucking steel on my throat. She rubbed her throat as if she was checking it was okay. Where'd he go? I saw Oni Lee for only a fraction of a second as he fell from the roof of the warehouse before he exploded into another cloud of white dust. Another point for the sniper team. Why had he been up there? Who or what had he been trying to see? The snipers, I breathed, whirling around. Where the sniper team had been, there were 4 figures now. I saw the rifle fall from the edge of the roof as the 2 soldiers struggled with a pair of Oni Lees. Then, puff, the clones were gone, and there was enough white dust around them that they wouldn't be drawing a bead on him again, even if they hadn't lost the rifle. But where had he gone from there? I looked around, feeling the panic begin to set in. Brutus made a roaring sound somewhere between a howl and a growl, not quite recognizable as either. He reared like a panicked horse, and I saw Oni Lee drop from the side of his head, land in a crouch and lunge for me, a knife in each hand. I swatted at his hands with my baton, sending one knife flying through the air and breaking his stride. It didn't matter. Less than a second later, he was dust. He'd teleported. Hands seized me from behind in a rough Nelson hold, pulling my arms out of the way as another Oni Lee materialized out of the dust in front of me, ready to capitalize on my inability to defend myself. Knowing he wasn't about to let go of me, I brought both my legs up in a kick at Oni Lee's stomach. They connected, and he doubled over. Brutus lunged forward, biting at him before he could recover. Both the Oni Lee that was holding me and the one clasped in Brutus's jaws turned to carbon ash, adding to the volume of the opaque, gritty white cloud that surrounded us. As Bitch managed to get Brutus under control, I saw his face. One of his eyes was in ruins, and volumes of blood and other liquids were flowing from it. "Fuck this," I growled, drawing the bugs out from my costume and retrieving the ones I'd had in the building. I spread them around, reaching for him, hoping for some sort of early warning. No sooner the thought crossed my mind than the silhouette of a figure appeared 20 feet to my right. He whipped his arm in my direction, and I didn't have any time to do much more than turn in his direction before something collided with my head. I stumbled and fell over backwards. In the instant I toppled over, I had the presence of mind to tuck my chin against my chest so I wouldn't add to my concussion. The armor covering my shoulders took the worst of the impact. As I lay there, trying to parse what had just happened, I realized that a small knife was embedded in the armored section of my mask, cracking the lens. A throwing knife? I pulled it free and pulled myself to my feet. I had enough bugs around me now that I could be sure he wasn't attacking us. That just raised the question of where he was. "Bitch, you okay?" I asked. "Fucker stabbed me in the arm." If that's the worst injury we get away with today, we can count ourselves lucky. I headed out of the cloud that surrounded us, hoping to get a better sense of the battlefield. I got out just in time to see Oni Lee tackling one of Coyle's snipers off the edge of the roof. Oni Lee disappeared in a cloud of white before he hit the ground. I was pretty sure the sniper hadn't. Sundancer was crumpled over, Labyrinth holding her shoulders. This was not going well. Oni Lee appeared 30 feet away from me, standing just to my left and behind me. My bugs gave me a sense of his position before anything else, and I threw myself to one side. I thought maybe I saw the shape of one of his throwing knives pass through the air where I'd been standing, but I wasn't seeing very well with a cracked lens on my mask. At my command, the bugs that had alerted me to his position gathered on him and began biting and stinging. Then I noticed something weird. More bugs popped into existence in the midst of the cloud, near Sundancer and Labyrinth. I felt the original bugs perish as they exploded into ash. He was taking them with him. I don't think he could help it. I could track his movements. "Bitch! Here!" I shouted. She lunged out of the cloud, still astride Brutus, pulling up short to avoid trampling me. "I can see where he's teleporting," I told her. "Get Judas and Angelica." She whistled, long and piercing. As if in response, Oni Lee appeared just a few feet away. "Behind you," I pointed. Brutus whipped around, snapping and snarling, and Oni Lee had to backpedal to escape being caught in the mutant's jaws. He disappeared just a second later. "Get one dog near those guys," I pointed to Sundancer and Labyrinth. "We should join them ASAP." She nodded, whistled, and pointed. No sooner did Judas and Angelica arrive at our sides than Judas headed off to his next destination. Bitch offered me a hand. I gratefully took it, letting her help me up onto Brutus's back. As we approached Sundancer and Labyrinth, the sidewalks on either side of us dropped out of existence, leaving only a bottomless pit where they had been. "The fuck?" I murmured. Then the buildings began to rise in height, some leaning over the street and joining with the others in grotesque arches and bridges. Brickwork stretched and extended into the alleyways, closing them off. Then windows began to shrink and warp, leaving only flat expanses of brick, concrete, and stucco for the building faces. Under our feet, the road began to shift in color, with some patches becoming paler and others darkening. They sharpened in definition as they settled into an alabaster white and jet black. A checkerboard? Brutus had to leap out of the way as one of the squares of the checkerboard suddenly rose to a height of 10 feet. As if in response, other squares began to rise and fall, each to varying, almost random heights. I was almost dismounted as another square appeared in a wall and slid out of the side of the building in a 30-foot-long horizontal pillar. We reached Safe Haven, an expanse of unaffected ground, 30 feet across, with two figures in the center, Sundancer and Labyrinth. "This is you?" I asked Labyrinth, awed as I climbed down off Brutus. She didn't reply. Instead, she reached out and touched the side of my chin. The images of arches, pillars, and checkerboard patterns fell away like a house of cards. "Hallucinations," I spoke, as Labyrinth made a waving gesture towards Bitch's head. She looked at me and shook her head slowly. "They're not hallucinations," I asked. She didn't reply. "You can't explain because you can't or don't talk," I realized, speaking my thoughts aloud. Oni Lee appeared a few feet away. I whirled and pointed. "There!" He was stumbling, moving to avoid something that wasn't there. He was still there, trying to get his balance, as I felt more bugs appear at another point on the opposite side of us. Only he appeared 15 feet in the air, fell, and landed in an awkward position, falling over. "Bitch!" I pointed. She whistled and pointed to send Angelica. Oni Lee's response was delayed, as if he couldn't even see her approaching at first. I felt more bugs pop into existence a second before she set her jaws on him. "There!" Bitch sent Judas next. Oni Lee's reaction was even slower, but he had time to throw himself onto his back, flinging two throwing knives into Judas's face and shoulder before he disappeared. "Over there!" I pointed as he reappeared. Bitch didn't even have time to give a command before there was a sound like a champagne cork being popped. Oni Lee screamed as one of his shins exploded in a spray of blood. I felt him reappear somewhere else, collapsing to the ground, while his predecessor endured having the kneecap on its good leg shot out. I followed the sound of a chamber being reloaded to spot Coyle's sniper. He was lying on his side at the foot of the building, one arm outstretched to hold his rifle steady. His right leg was bent the wrong way. He'd been knocked off a 3-story building, had a broken leg at the very least, and had still managed to retrieve, load, and fire his rifle. If he was willing to be that professional, I could damn well play spotter for him. "There," I pointed in Oni Lee's direction. On the warehouse again. There were two more muted popping sounds, and I could see Oni Lee spin in a pirouette of sorts as a shot clipped him before he collapsed to the rooftop. He exploded in a cloud of ash once again, except I hadn't felt him appear anywhere. "He's gone," I said, out of my range. Sundancer looked up at me, one gloved hand on her shoulder. "Good," she managed to answer. "You okay?" "He gouged my shoulder. I'll need stitches, but it's not the worst injury I've had." "Okay, a man Coyle's guy," I spoke, trying hard to organize my thoughts and priorities with the adrenaline that was pumping through me. "You going to be all right?" "Yeah," he rasped, then he coughed. I'd have to take him at his word. "Labyrinth, watch him. Make sure he keeps breathing and that his buddy knows where he is," I said. "Sundancer, bitch, we've got to go help neuter." Arc 5, Hive, Part 8. I didn't like leaving Labyrinth behind after seeing her help turn the tide of our fight against Oni Lee, but I couldn't use someone that couldn't communicate with me. Bitch, Sundancer and I all sat astride Brutus as he headed towards the warehouse once again. My bugs lagged behind us. "We should be fighting Lung," Bitch growled, "not helping the freak." "What?" Sundancer asked. "Why wouldn't we help him?" "His fault if he got hurt," Bitch snarled. "And if you got hurt," Sundancer challenged her, "you'd want us to leave you?" "Fuck no, but I wouldn't be surprised if you did." "We're helping him," I stated, firm. "Yeah? I'm the one telling this big lug where to go." She slapped her hand on the side of Brutus's neck a few times. I would have yelled at her, should have maybe. Instead, I just leaned forward until I was pressing against her back and spoke into her ear. "We let him die. You think Faultline's gonna let it slide? She might hurt or kill Tattletale or Regent in retaliation." My piece said. I leaned back and waited to see how she'd respond. If that wasn't enough to convince her, and I had no idea if it would be, I was ready to try jumping off Brutus's back and seeing what I could do to help neuter on my own. Bitch didn't reply. She didn't take us around, over or through the building either, though. When we stopped, it was by the stairwell leading up to where Neuter had fallen. The business they had been into wasn't prostitution or slave trading. Long tables were arranged around the ground floor of the warehouse, with stools lined up beside them. On those tables were shallow boxes with blocks and piles of a white powder. Various tools, rulers, funnels, scales, measuring cups, and no-name brand boxes of sealable plastic bags were arranged around each station. Heroin? Cocaine? I didn't know my drugs well enough to guess. The center of the room had been left more or less clear, maybe so cars or trucks could pull in. So the employees had been wearing little to no clothing, presumably, to keep the clothes clean of the white dust, or maybe to keep them from pocketing any drugs for themselves. The building rumbled with an impact, and I was reminded of the business at hand. Was I more distracted than usual right now? Was it the concussion? Bitch had been right before. The stairwell and what I could see of the second floor was too low for both a dog and a rider. I hopped off Brutus' back, stumbling a bit as I landed, then headed up the stairs, taking them two at a time. Neuter was lying in a puddle of blood, in the midst of a bunch of thugs, who were all lying down, crawling or writhing, oblivious to my existence. Seeing the thugs was enough to remind me of how dangerous it would be to touch Neuter. I was wearing gloves and leggings with padded soles, but would that be enough? The dragline silk I'd used for my costume was mostly waterproof, but the weave itself was porous, and I was worried enough that touching his blood could mean a terminal overdose that I couldn't risk it. My approach stopped short of the puddle. Neuter had a knife wound just below his shoulder blade that traced around his side, as long as my forearm and deep enough that I couldn't tell how bad the damage was. He was breathing, but his breaths were shallow enough that I almost couldn't tell. I was here. I could bend down to touch him, but I was helpless to do anything. Moments after I made contact with his skin, even with my gloves on, and I'd probably be on some hallucinogenic drug trip, flopping around like a fish on dry land. Bitch and Sundancer approached from behind me, stopping at my side. Bitch, go downstairs, check the supplies they were using with the drugs. Look for rubber gloves, saran wrap, anything like that. If you can't find anything, look in the bathroom under the sinks. I doubt there'll be a first aid kit, but if you can find one, bring it. Bitch didn't answer, but she headed down the stairs. Just to be safe, as my bugs reached the building, I swept the flying ones through the rooms to help me look for first aid supplies and to keep an eye on Bitch and the rest of the building. What are we doing? Sundancer asked. You're staying with him. See if you can get a response. Talk to him. I'm checking in there. I pointed to the office at the end of the hall. Just in front of the door, there was a gaping hole in the wall and a pile of debris. The mess Judas had made when he'd lunged through the side of the building to corner Oni Lee. I had a dim recollection of what my bugs had sensed when they'd first entered the building and checked out the room. I'd been more focused on the people and potential booby traps, but I remembered that it had been an office, with a desk and a curtained-off area with a bed. Maybe the bed was there so the guys in charge could take turns sleeping there, ensuring there was always someone to keep an eye on things. Maybe it was for the half-dressed employees, for taking advantage of them, or so there was a place to put the ones that accidentally overdosed while working. Entering the office, I confirmed my suspicions about the existence of the bed. I began stripping the badly stained sheets off. Was it odd that this place freaked me out 10 times as much as nearly getting offed by Oni Lee? Drugs had always spooked the hell out of me. One of the first times I'd ever ridden a bus, when I was around 5 or 6, I'd seen a meth head freak out, making enough of a ruckus that the driver had to stop and force him off. I'd never really gotten over that first impression, where just the idea of being around someone that was high made me sort of anxious. It wasn't just that either. In grade school and junior high, I'd had classmates drop off the face of the planet, hearing only rumors and hints from other classmates or my teachers that there were drugs involved. Either my classmates themselves getting caught up in things, or parents or siblings dragging the kid into their mess, to the point that the kid couldn't come to school, one as bad as the other. Almost from the beginning, I'd had this sense of drugs as this unstoppable black hole of fucked upness that swallowed in anyone close to the addict. Yet people did it. It was something common and profitable enough that in an area like Brockton Bay, where there were as many people unemployed as not, the ABB needed a money counting machine in this very office. Profitable enough that they had an open safe with stacks of bills inside. My bugs weren't doing much, so I set them the task of collecting the money. Within a second or two of my having the thought, the mass of roaches, centipedes, pillbugs, and ants flowed into the piles of money and began pushing it all off the desk or into paper bags. Houseflies and wasps gathered on the bills that tried to fly through the air and retrieve them. It wasn't perfect, it was a little clumsy, but it still caught me off guard just how well they were able to coordinate for something like that, without any conscious direction on my part. I couldn't let myself get distracted. I could put my bugs on autopilot and have them finish the job while I focused on more important things. Pulling off the bed sheets, I uncovered a plastic sheet, the kind you used when your kids wet the bed. Doped out drug addicts, too, maybe. The top of the plastic sheet looked kind of grody, but I wasn't in a position to be picky. I pulled it off the mattress, balled it up in my hands, and hurried back into the hall. "Help me," I ordered Sundancer. With her help, I laid out the plastic sheet bottom side up at Neuter's feet. By the time we had it flat and ready, Bitch was returning. "Found 2 pairs of plastic gloves and some rubber gloves under a sink," she said. "First aid kit too, but it feels light." "Open it," I said, taking a pair of plastic gloves. It was awkward, fitting them over my normal gloves, but I managed it. Sundancer just pulled off her costume gloves and put on the plastic ones. She was Caucasian, I noted, pale. "Tell me what's inside fast." "Got some tape, bandages, thermometer, safety pins, rubbing alcohol, soap. Needle, thread?" I asked. "No." "Gauze pads, big bandages?" "No." With our plastic gloves on, Sundancer and I managed to haul Neuter onto the plastic sheet. The moment she let go, Sundancer winced and reached up to her shoulder, but she stopped short of actually touching it. I turned to my teammate. "Bitch, go downstairs. Those people who were in here took their clothes off, and my bugs say they stashed the clothes in a room below us. Find me some purses, as many as you can grab, as fast as you can grab them." She didn't move this time. She just glared at me. "Fucking move," I shouted at her. She gave me the evil eye before she left again. "Bandages are going to be too small," Sundancer said, as I tried to wrestle Neuter's blood-slick tail onto the plastic sheet. "Douse them in the alcohol. Use them to clean the injury of blood. Use the dry bandages to pat it dry so the tape can stick. Don't be afraid to get into the wound. Just be gentle." She nodded and began working on it. I grabbed the tape and began fumbling with it. 2 pairs of gloves on, and I couldn't lift off the end of it. I grabbed my knife and used the edge-it to get the job done. Once I had the tape, I began holding the wound closed and taping crosswise across it. I could only hope I was doing the right things here. A month of weekend first aid classes had not prepared me for this. Bitch arrived with purses and practically threw them at me. I could have gotten pissed, but Neuter couldn't afford for me to. I began emptying the purses onto the ground beside me and sorting through the contents. Pens, wallets, headphones, books, tampons, pictures, receipts, more receipts, change, keys, yet more receipts. "What are you looking for?" Sundancer asked. The third purse turned up what I needed: sanitary pads. I tore one open and pressed it to the wound, then began taping it down. Unasked for, Sundancer grabbed another and opened it so it would be ready for me. Sterile, absorbent, covers more area than the bandage can. I got around to answering her question. If he lives, his teammates might give him a hard time, but it's better than nothing. "You didn't tape it down all the way," Sundancer pointed out. "Only 3 sides." I agreed, "so it can breathe." I only vaguely recalled some instruction on that front. I was hoping it was right. If I failed here, what right did I have to call myself an aspiring hero? When the wound was bandaged as much as I could manage, the 3 of us bundled him up in the sheet and lifted him. Bitch and Sundancer had an injured arm and shoulder, respectively, so they both took his head and shoulders while I took his feet. With agonizing slowness, we carried him down the stairs. Then, as carefully as we could manage with a body weighing half again as much as any of us, we draped him across Brutus's shoulders. A bone-jarring crash nearly undid all of our hard work. Brutus nearly lost his footing at the impact, and I know I would have fallen if I hadn't already been holding on to him. A gauntleted hand as wide across as my arm span had crashed through the wall. The whole building shuddered as another hand punched through the brick of the wall 20 feet from the first hole. Fingers gripped the building and pulled the entire section of wall out in one piece. "Go!" I shouted at Bitch. "Take him to the others. Call Tattletale. Get the number for that Cape doctor. Get medical attention for anyone who needs it." She hesitated, opened her mouth to protest. I raised my voice. "Do not fuck with me here." There was a rumble outside as the removed section of wall was thrown against the ground outside. Hard. Just an instant later, a half-dozen ABB members retreated into the warehouse through the hole, taking cover from the giantesses. They saw us and stopped short, wary, weapons ready but not raised or pointed at us. Lung followed his thugs into the room. He was bigger than I'd seen him yet at nearly 15 feet in height, and was covered in layers of scales that left him barely recognizable as human. Spear-like growths stuck out of his shoulders in what I realized were the beginnings of wings. His mask had been torn off at some point, and the features of his face had been warped by his transformation. The shape of his skull and face were more cat-like than human, and his nose and mouth were a single X-shaped opening, bristling with pointed teeth that stuck in every direction. I could see why he usually wore the mask. "Bitch," I murmured, "if you don't leave now, I don't think you're going to get another chance." But, which do you want more? To fight here and now, or to make sure Faultline and the other groups don't have an excuse to do anything to our teammates? I saw her hesitate. The fact that she even had to think about it, I could have slapped her. Kaiser strolled in, unworried, unhurried. Lung moved like he was going to lunge for him, then stopped just in time to avoid impaling himself on the narrow blade of steel that had erupted from the ground, pointed at his heart. I wasn't sure if it would have penetrated his covering of scales, but if I were Lung, I don't think I would have gambled on it either. Fenja and Menja reduced their size to fit through the hole they'd made in the wall, then grew again as they had the headroom. They settled at a height of 18 or 20 feet. Fenja carried a sword and round shield, while Menja had a spear, or the other way around, whatever. In the corner of my eye, I saw Bitch hop onto Brutus, then ride in the direction of the sniper team and Labyrinth, a wrapped-up neuter lying limp in front of her. Judas and Angelica remained behind, not far from Sundancer and I. Their entire bodies were taut with tension, their heads low as they glared at the new arrivals. Lung turned to survey the room. His men were arranged in a loose circle around him, facing us. His eyes settled on me. "Ooh," he rumbled. His words were distorted by the shape of his altered mouth, but it was easy enough to guess what he'd just said. "You." Arc 5, Hive, Part 9. "Yeah, me," I answered Lung, hoping I sounded more confident than I felt. "Some history?" Sundancer murmured. "I made his crotch rot off." She turned to stare at me. "Accidentally. How do you?" She started, then she stopped as Lung's growl rose in volume enough to turn her head. Angelica and Judas advanced steadily until they were on either side of me. "Step down, Undersider," Kaiser spoke from the opposite end of the room. "My girls and I have this in hand." "Do you?" I challenged him, not breaking eye contact with Lung, because Lung looks like he's in pretty good shape there. You know how this works, right? He only gets stronger the longer you fight him. If you haven't finished him off by now, you're probably not going to. Lung chuckled, low and gravelly. He craned his neck to look at Kaiser, and I shivered. His neck alone was nearly as long as my torso and thicker at the base, tapering down to a more or less normal-sized head. What was creepier was that he'd bent his neck in a U shape to look behind himself. It was a movement that a gymnast would have been hard-pressed to perform with their back. It wouldn't be long before he just wasn't recognizable as something who had once been human. The 6 of his thugs that were gathered around him looked like they were almost as scared of him as they were of us. "What would you propose then?" Kaiser asked me. "Sundancer and I will help out," I told him. I glanced at Sundancer, and she nodded. Lung laughed again. Ooh, a gur? Before I could figure out what he just said to me, he lunged straight at me, passing between two of his people, moving on all fours. I'd sent the flying insects and wasps into the room to help Bitch search for supplies, and I directed them straight for Lung as soon as I realized what he was doing. Too little, too late. Then Judas intercepted him. The pair of them rolled and tumbled, and I couldn't tell which of them was making which snarling or growling noise. When the momentum of Judas's pounce had stopped carrying them across the floor, Lung managed to get his footing first and physically heaved Judas across the main floor of the warehouse. Judas slammed into two sets of the long tables, sending clouds of white powder billowing around him. When Angelica made her move, Lung was ready for her. He caught hold of her snout and foreclaw before she could do any damage and leveraged her forward momentum to throw her, too, straight at Judas. There was an almost judo or aikido kind of style to the throw, except I doubted either of them were human enough for normal moves and techniques to apply. What was more likely, I thought, that his reflexes, flexibility, and strength were on a level where that sort of thing came naturally to him. In any case, my bodyguards, if you could call them that, had been tossed aside away like they were stuffed animals. Lung didn't drop to all fours again as he advanced toward me. Instead, he flexed his right hand, and my eyes were drawn to the foot-long blades that tipped each finger. Sundancer? I asked, quiet. Help me out? If I used my power, I'd probably hurt you worse than I hurt him. That line is getting old fast. Lung lunged again, and I threw myself to one side, too slow, too short a distance. With the sound of swords being drawn out of their sheaths, a barrier of blades and spears rose up from the ground between Lung and I. I found traction on the asphalt with my hands and feet, and I managed to half crawl, half run away from him. Lung started to move around the barrier of blades, only to be blocked by another bristling growth. He roared, then leapt for the rafters up at the ceiling. I knew what he was doing almost right away and ran for cover. Once he had a grip up there, it would be a matter of using his grip on the steel girders that lined the ceiling to jump straight at me. I wasn't 2 paces before I knew there was no cover I could get to fast enough. Except he didn't get that far. A square pillar of steel, as tall and long as an 18-wheeler, speared downward from the roof, straight at him. It caught Lung in his midsection and shoved him down into the ground, hard. A few seconds later, the weight of the block of steel tore it from the section of ceiling it was rooted in. It didn't hit anyone as it dropped down, but I could guess it would have killed someone. I could feel the impact of it striking the ground in my bones. I looked at Kaiser. He was standing where he'd been when he walked into the room, hands clasped behind his back. Menja. Kaiser's order wasn't shouted, but it could be heard across the warehouse, if you could call it an order. But the two 18-foot-tall Valkyries seemed to know what he wanted. They advanced towards Lung with their weapons drawn, and Lung's people began backing slowly away. I felt a pang of sympathy for Lung's rank and file, mainly for the ones who'd been coerced into this. They'd probably seen what Fenja and Menja were capable of earlier, but they couldn't run without risking their boss's wrath. Caught between a rock and a hard place. Lung wasn't quite down and out yet, though. He started climbing to his feet, only to have a pyramid of crisscrossing blades spear up around him. Blades appeared under and over his arms, just beneath his armpit, behind his knee, by his groin, with dozens more rising above and around him. Before he could find his way out, he was trapped, buried and hidden beneath the layers of steel. Kaiser inclined his chin, looking toward the ceiling, and I saw a shimmer. The tip of a blade began to emerge from one of the iron girders above, revealing itself at a glacial pace. It was no more than a half-foot thick, but nearly 20 feet wide. I wasn't sure if it was an optical illusion from the rippling energies of Kaiser's power or not, but I thought maybe the ceiling was sagging under the weight of it. If he wasn't careful, he'd bring the roof down on our heads. Then Kaiser lowered his head to face the area where Lung was trapped, and the massive sword he'd manifested in the ceiling plunged down into the pyramid in a heartbeat. Sparks showered as the gargantuan blade sheared through the trap, but there was more hot metal that wasn't a result of the impact. When I looked again, I saw Lung had avoided the blade. The side of the pyramid closest to me glowed a white-orange, the blades curling and sagging in the intensity of the heat. He'd softened the metal enough with his pyrokinesis that he could use his monstrous strength and push his way free. Enough, at least, to avoid being divided in two. Lung roared as he climbed free. As Kaiser raised more blades around him, Lung swung his claws and shattered the metal, sending the pieces sliding across the floor. "Arr!" Lung growled. "You're an animal, Lung," Kaiser answered him. "Even without your power making you into this. Go down." As if to punctuate his statement, a spear of solid steel erupted from the wall and slammed into Lung, carrying him to the end of the room opposite where Judas and Angelica were. Lung managed to grip the spear and move himself so the spear point wasn't pressed against his chest when it punctured the concrete of the wall. "Your people, animals," Kaiser intoned. Not 6 paces away from me, one of Lung's thugs let out a raw scream and collapsed to the ground. Dagger-like blades had pierced the tops of his feet mid-stride. As he used his hands to break his fall, another set of blades punched through his palms. The screams of the other thugs echoed his. He was on his hands and knees, unable to move with his hands and feet effectively nailed to the ground. "Kaiser!" I shouted. "No!" "Not your business, little girl," Kaiser told me, turning in my direction. I took an immediate step back, fearing blades would appear under my feet. "This is wrong," I said, as I watched a sliver of steel sprout out of the ground and rise with a controlled speed to the base of the thug's throat. He was forced to arch his back and raise his head to the absolute limits to avoid getting a very unnecessary tracheotomy. I glanced at Lung. He was watching what was happening, but I couldn't read his alien expression. "Wrong?" Kaiser chuckled. "As far as I'm concerned, the moment you need to fall back on morals to argue something, you've already lost the argument. This is war." Lung moved for Kaiser this time. He virtually rolled to one side to avoid an outcropping of spear points, angled in a way that he might have run himself through on them, then resumed his charge. One of the giantess twins stepped in, kicking Lung into and almost through a wall. Lung bounced back almost immediately, drawing on his pyrokinesis to direct a column of blue-yellow flame at her. The other twin intercepted the fire with her shield. A few seconds later, she was stumbling back and away from Lung and throw her shield away to avoid having the heated metal burn her arm. Kaiser's team wasn't going to win this on their own. As much as I despised stepping in and helping him. "Sundancer, now would be a great time to use your power," I spoke. As I said the words, I called on every bug that was in the area and sent them to Lung. "It's not no, I'll burn them. Then burn them. If you don't use your power, I can pretty much guarantee Lung will burn them worse." "Doubt it," Sundancer replied, but she raised her hands in front of her, and there was a brilliant flare of light, only a fraction of a second, but enough to leave a black-blue spot in the center of my vision. There was a brief roaring sound as the light faded. I turned my focus to my bugs as another flicker of light appeared, longer and stronger than the first, again accompanied by that faint roar. "Hey, Skitter, was it?" Sundancer spoke. "Yeah," I said. "Get back. Way back." I ran for it, pulling my mask up and bringing my fingers to my mouth in the best whistle I could manage. 2 seconds later, Angelica shoved her snout between my legs. Had it been a movie, or if I'd been Bitch, maybe I would have been able to slide or jump back and land on her neck or shoulders, right on from there. As it was, I half fell, half rolled over the top of her head, and only barely managed to get a grip on a spike on her shoulder. I clung to that as she ran, praying I wouldn't fall and get trampled. "Angelica, stop, stay!" I called out, hoping she knew the command, that she'd listen. She did, slowing her pace to a walk, then stopping just by the loading bay door we'd come in. Judas caught up and walked around her until he was just in front of us. He was still covered in the white dust, but it didn't seem to be having any real effect on him. I hopped down from Angelica's side, ready to climb on her and jostle her into action if Lung made another attempt to come after me. I wasn't sure I could steer her, but with the prospect of Lung chasing me, I'd rather be moving totally uncontrolled at Angelica's speed than anything my own 2 feet could offer. Sundancer had managed to get her power going. A ball of light, larger than a basketball, smaller than a beach ball, sat between her hands. Light? That was it? Then I saw the floor. The warehouse had clearly been raised above a flat expanse of asphalt, maybe an old parking lot, and the surface had cracked and been patched a fair bit over the years. It still bore the oil stains from the old days. Directly below Sundancer, the floor was normal. Starting around 5 feet from her, though, the ground looked wet, glassy. The asphalt was melting. She dropped her hands, and the ball of light rose. Like it had a mind of its own, it darted towards Lung, zipping left and right and up and down as it moved. I saw how it rose higher as it moved over Lung's people, who were still nailed to the floor. At one point, it moved only 10 or so feet over one of the tables, and the plastic surface of the table seemed to crumple up in fast motion, turning black and smoldering with tongues of flame. I scattered my swarm, all too aware they weren't doing a thing to Lung, knowing they'd just die when Sundancer got her orb to Lung. She didn't make it touch him, but seeing what it had done to the table, I thought maybe that was a good thing. Lung raised a hand towards the light, and I could see the heat shimmers in the air. She pushed it a little closer to him, and his legs buckled. Kaiser was apparently unwilling to let Sundancer steal the show, because he brought a shaft of metal out of the wall behind Lung, shoving Lung toward the orb. Sundancer moved the ball back, but just the second or so of close proximity to the ball was enough to take the fight out of Lung. He fell to all fours, tried to move, and found the asphalt like a molten tar beneath him. Wasn't he supposed to be fireproof? Or was that immunity only to the flames he made with his own power? Or, I thought, was that ball of light, Sundancer's miniature sun, that hot? I was lingering at the exit, watching and waiting to see the outcome. My bugs were prepared and ready, lingering as close as they could get without being wiped out by the superheated air. Even with his superhuman constitution, even with his pyrokinesis to maybe take the edge off the effect, Lung was clearly suffering. Just a matter of time, I realized, before he collapsed. Probably, I supposed, much longer than one would think, with his regeneration. Then the light of Sundancer's orb winked out. It took me a few long moments of blinking the spots out of my eyes before I could make out the scene in its entirety. Lung was limp, his arms dangling at his sides. He was still bent over, and he might have fallen face first into the tar if it wasn't for the spear of iron that was impaling him through the heart. "What did you do?" Sundancer shouted. "Obviously," Kaiser said. "I ended it." It was already over. I was under the impression very few people really argued with Kaiser. Fenja and Menja joined him, one on either side of him, and neither of them were sheathing their weapons or shrinking back to a normal size. I took that to be a very bad sign. I was so preoccupied with watching Kaiser that I almost missed what happened next. It started as a flash of crimson in the corner of my eye. I looked, and I saw Lung's wings fully unfurled, like the wings of a bat, only they had silvery scales where the bat had fur, and the flesh that stretched between the fingers of the wings was the deep, dark red of blood. Lung grabbed the spear that impaled his chest and snapped it with his claws. He stood, and his entire midsection seemed to arrange so he stood another foot or two taller. Taking hold of the fragment that was still embedded in his chest, he slowly slid it out. Once it free, he cast it aside. It clattered to the floor of the warehouse. We were so quiet, you could hear the ringing of the steel as it settled on the ground. "Sundancer, run!" I shouted, breaking the stillness. I sent my bugs swarming to Lung. Anything to block his vision, distract him for even a second. The events that followed seemed to happen in slow motion. Lung repeated what he'd been trying to do as the fight opened, only nothing seemed capable of getting in his way, now. He was faster, stronger, more maneuverable. He lunged toward Kaiser, using his wings to carry him effortlessly above a growth of steel blades. Reaching Kaiser, he slammed the man into the wall. Kaiser went limp, but Lung repeated the process, banging him against the brick of the warehouse wall a half-dozen times in the span of seconds. When he was done, he flung Kaiser away like a toy. Fenja had to drop her spear to catch Kaiser in her arms, which seemed to be exactly what Lung wanted. Lung did the same I-explode trick he'd done to wipe out my bugs in my first encounter with him, only it was 10 times the explosion, 10 times as big. The two giantesses staggered back, which gave Lung the opportunity to dart across the floor and drive his flattened, clawed hand into Menja's belly like a knife. As he withdrew his claw, she collapsed. Nessa! Fenja screamed. Lung ignored her and started walking towards Sundancer and I. Fenja rushed to her sister's side, still carrying Kaiser. Sundancer began forming her miniature sun once more, with increasingly frequent flickers of light and fire gathering between her hands. No, Lung boomed. He raised his bloody claw, and the flame in Sundancer's hands dissipated, slipping out of her grasp like greased eels. She tried once more, and again he thwarted her with an almost casual ease. Before she could make a third attempt, Lung blasted her with a torrent of roaring flame. For 2, 3, 4 seconds, the fire washed over her, consumed her. When he stopped, there were tongues of flame dancing on the asphalt around her. Even her costume had fire lingering on it, but both she and her costume were untouched. She, at least, was fireproof, or she'd had to be to avoid being burned by her own power. She wasn't, however, invincible. As the flames of his attack dissipated, Lung was made visible again, revealed to be standing right in front of her. He barely seemed to care she was there as he backhanded her aside. Then he turned his attention to me. Just me left, really. I swallowed hard, drew my very underwhelming knife, and stood straight, facing Lung. Please don't burn me, please, please. Look at this knife and see it as an insult, an excuse to trounce me physically. Angelica started snarling at Lung. She took a step toward him. No, I ordered her. Back. The snarls ceased and she looked at me. Back, I repeated. When I took a step toward Lung, she didn't follow. A powder-covered Judas stood 15 feet away, tense, but not approaching either. Good. No use in anyone else getting hurt. There was nothing else she could do. Hell, I was almost positive there was nothing else I could do. My bugs gathered on Lung, but as far as I could tell, there was no skin anymore. No flesh to bite, nothing to sting. Lung rumbled with a rough, guttural chuckle and let a brief flame wash over him, wiping the swarm out of existence. I dispersed the bugs in his vicinity that hadn't yet had a chance to touch him and get burned for their trouble. No point. Detrimental, almost. Then Bitch, riding Brutus, bounded down from the hole in the ceiling and crashed into Lung. Bitch! I shouted, too late. No! Once he got over the shock of the initial impact, Lung used one hand to grab Bitch from where she sat on Brutus's back and took hold of Brutus by the neck with his other. Heaving his arm and Brutus to his left side, then to his right, Lung casting the dog head over heels through the air. Judas and Angelica began to move forward, but stopped when Lung elicited a scream of pain from Bitch. No, Lung rumbled. Stop! I shouted, stepping forward again. I'm the one you want, aren't I? It always sounded so good when you heard it in the movies. As I realized what I just said, it only sounded stupid. He advanced toward me, carrying Bitch like a careless 7-year-old might carry a cat. I backed away, but his stride was long enough for him to close the gap effortlessly. He grabbed me and hefted me into the air, lifting me above his head so he could look up at me. Ugh! Her! He couldn't talk, so I couldn't even fall back on the tired old cliche of getting him to monologue. Fuck. He had my neck encircled with thumb and forefinger, 2 claws at my rib cage, and his pinky finger at my midsection, just below my waist. He squeezed a fraction tighter, and I groaned. The fabric of my costume was preventing the edges of his claws from cutting into me, but it wasn't reinforced to stop me from being crushed. I directed a bug into his eye. It stayed there, wings fluttering in staccato. It was annoying enough for him to drop Bitch and deal with it. He didn't give her a chance to escape, though. Before he dealt with the bug, he shoved her against the ground and stepped on her, holding her down with his clawed foot. That done, he used the points of his claw to pick the bug from his eye socket. He chuckled again, low, gravelly, as he examined the cockroach impaled on his claw tip. Aro? Cockroach? He lowered his arm so I was at his eye level. Then he squeezed again, weaker than the first time, shook me, not as hard as he could have. Then his arm sagged again until my toes were brushing the ground. After shaking me, his grip had loosened and he hadn't really tightened it, so I managed to get my knee against the base of his palm and shove myself backward, push myself free. My feet touched asphalt and I backed up a few steps. Har! He rumbled. Don't fucking underestimate me, I snarled in response. I don't know if he heard me. I hadn't even finished the sentence before I had to skip backward 2 steps to avoid being crushed beneath him as he collapsed face first to the asphalt. Bitch, you okay? I asked. She was picking herself off the ground. She nodded. What happened? She asked. I sheathed my knife and reached for my cell phone with one hand. My other hand I extended with the palm up. A cockroach settled on it. Wasn't sure it would work or if it'd be enough. Took a bit of caterpillar, had a roach swab it in that pool of blood Neuter left upstairs, and mashed the thing in Lung's eye. Big and tough as he is, a drug that's strong in the mucous membranes of the eye, so close to the brain, apparently it's enough. Bitch folded her arms, looking down at Lung. Then she looked up at me. Now what? It was a surprisingly apt question coming from her. Did we just leave him here? He'd be all better in a matter of minutes. There were options. I just didn't like any of them. I dialed Tattletale's phone, but it was Regent who answered. Hey, he said. A lemon, I said. C, grass, he replied. You wouldn't believe it. We found one of Bakuta's workshops. The stuff she has here is crazy. No time to chat. I need to talk to Tattletale fast. She's checking the place for booby traps. Distractions probably aren't a good idea. It's kind of important, I said, looking down at Lung, right? 2 seconds later, Tattletale's voice was on the other end. Hey? Quick question. I have to be sure, which is why I'm calling you. Lung heals, right? Yeah, wait, Lung's there? Unconscious at my feet, but I don't know how long, so answer fast. He heals? He's already healing what I did to him from last time, right? Right, he'll heal pretty much anything, given time, provided he isn't dead. Lose an arm, he'd grow it back in a few months. Thanks, that's what I needed to know, I said. Good luck with the booby traps. I hung up. Then I looked down at Lung. I drew my knife. Why the knife? Bitch asked. I think anyone else might have sounded concerned. She just sounded curious. I'm ending this. I grabbed one of the larger spikes that framed Lung's face and heaved it to one side so his accordion-like neck was outstretched, face upturned. No time to be delicate about it. I had no idea how strong the toxins in Neuter's blood were, or how fast Lung's biology would process it. I jammed the knife into Lung's eye socket. His head and consequently his eyes weren't as large as you'd think, in proportion to the rest of his frame, but the tissue around it was tough. I had to leverage the knife back and forth before I was able to pry his eyeball out. It was hot to the touch as I held it in the palm of my hand, no bigger than a ping-pong ball. The second eye was faster, though no less messy. When I was done, I stood, sheathed my knife, and backed away from Lung's body. Shouldn't I feel worse about this? Shouldn't I feel sick or grossed out or disturbed by the morality of it? I didn't even feel cold the way Gru had described. It just felt like something I had to do. I glanced at the 2 eyeballs clasped in my hand, then put them out of my mind. I surveyed the room. Priorities? I asked Bitch first. The dogs are okay. If I placed them second to anyone else but her, or if I forgot to ask, I got the feeling Bitch would mind. They'll heal when they turn back to normal. Sundancer? I asked. Sundancer was lying on her side, one arm pressed against the shoulder Oni Lee had stabbed. I'm okay. That was everyone I gave a damn about, leaving only Fenja, Menja, and Kaiser. I looked across the room and called out, Fenja? The giantess nodded. Get your sister to a hospital or whichever doctor your guys use. Get your boss taken care of. She stood without giving me a response. Her sister had shrunk enough for her to cradle in her arms. Kaiser, for his part, was slung over her shoulder, limp. Oh, Fenja, she paused. I'll leave it to you to make the call, but if you think Kaiser has a sense of honor, maybe point out it would be bad form to push the point on the dogfighting thing after we dealt with Lung for him, saved his life. She nodded, then ducked through the opening in the wall. I stepped toward Sundancer and offered a hand to help her up. She flinched away. Oh, my hands were bloody. I dropped the offered hand to my side. Let's go, I suggested. Arc 5, Hive, Part 10. Brockton Bay 911. What is your emergency? Multiple injured, I said, glancing at the nearest street sign. Warehouse at Whitemore and Sunset. Send police and capes too. These guys are ABB members. There was the briefest of pauses. That's Whitemore and Sunset? Whitemore and Sunset, yes. Listen, the leader of the ABB, a parahuman by the name of Lung, is incapacitated at the scene, but that won't be entirely true for long. He's drugged and blinded, but the drugs will be out of his system before too long. You're a cape? She asked. Can I get your identification? I repeat, I ignored her. He's drugged and blinded, but only the blindness will be a factor when the first responders arrive on the scene. Warn them to be careful. You can also tell them that a second parahuman calling himself Oni Lee was present but fled after being injured. He may still be in the area. I understand. The Protectorate will be informed before they arrive on scene. I've got ambulances, police, and PRT teams on their way. Can I please get your identification? I hung up. I can't believe you carved out his eyes, Sundancer said. We were walking briskly back to where we'd left Labyrinth. He'll heal, I pointed out, eventually. You blinded someone who was helpless to fight back. That's kind of fucked up. I couldn't say much to that. Fucked up or not, it had been necessary. I couldn't have dealt with it if I'd known we left him there, and he got back to business as usual by the end of the day. I'd stopped him, best as I was able. Okay. All right, I was willing to admit that maybe the means were a little suspect. I'd fought alongside some fucked up people. I'd maimed him. By letting Fenja, Menja, and Kaiser go, I'd sort of condoned what they'd done to Lung's men. But in the end, it was what I'd wanted to do when I'd wanted to be a superhero. I'd taken down a horrible person. I just hoped the heroes could clean up the mess and get Lung behind bars for good this time. Hey, bitch, I said, why'd you come back? I couldn't phrase it better without offending her, but I wanted to know was why she'd come back when she was supposed to be taking Neuter and Coil's soldier to a doctor. Bitch was sitting tall astride Brutus. She seemed to get my meaning. The other soldier said he was a trained medic. Told me he could handle it, so I came back to fight. Ah, I said. Got it. Bitch hadn't been lying, I saw, as we approached the rest of our group. Neuter was bandaged and awake, while the other soldier was lying down, unconscious, maybe drugged for the pain. You made it, Neuter grinned. Barely, I admitted. You okay? I'm tougher than I look, he responded. Benefit of my, unique biology. Cool, I replied, feeling lame for not having a better reply, but I couldn't think of anything to say that wouldn't sound like it was trying too hard, or worse, sound sarcastic. This fella says you guys probably saved my life. Neuter jerked a thumb toward the one of Coil's guys that was awake. Honest, I'm having a hard time believing you're up and talking right now, the medic replied. Anyways, thanks, Neuter said, eyes moving from me to Sundancer to bitch and back again. No problem, I answered him, feeling lame for not having a better or more suitable reply. Embarrassed, I looked for a reason to change the subject. Look, we should get out of here in the next few minutes. Capes, cops, and ambulances are on their way to deal with the aftermath. All right, Neuter said, but I have to ask, a small army of roaches dropped those off? He was smiling as he pointed to a spot near where he was lying. A stack of paper bags were organized in a pile. I forgot I did that, I admitted. It didn't feel right to leave the ABB's money behind if we wound up retreating, so I had my bugs haul it out of there. Everyone might as well take a bag. We can take it? Asked. You sure? I shrugged in response. The money didn't matter much to me. Consider it a bonus, a thanks for helping. It's not exactly divided to be fair, so no insult intended if any of them end up being a bag full of ones. No complaints, Neuter said. He reached out with his tail and used it in circle and pick up a bag. Coil's guy gave him a hand in standing up, and you could see him wince and huff out of breath at the effort. He swayed a bit on his feet, then put a hand on Labyrinth's shoulder to steady himself. Sundancer grabbed a bag, and Coil's medic spotter grabbed two. Labyrinth didn't reach for one, so I walked over, grabbed one, and held it out for her. She didn't respond. I'll hold that for her, Neuter offered. Is she okay? She's pretty much normal, for her anyways. He claimed the bag, leaving 3 for Bitch and I, but nobody was complaining or pointing that out. You guys need a ride? I asked. Neuter shook his head, then pointed to a manhole cover a ways down the road. We'll head back to one of our hideouts through there. Familiar territory for me. Is that a good idea with your injury? I mean, stating the obvious, but it's going to be pretty gross down there. He smiled. Can't get an infection. My biology's toxic to the bacteria and parasites, I think. Never been sick that I can remember. Of course. Now I felt dumb for making Sundancer use the alcohol to sterilize him and for going the extra mile with the sanitary pads to ensure what I was using was clean. "And you guys?" I asked Coil's guy. "Ride? We've got one, but thanks." The medic bent down, bound his buddy's wrists, and then pulled the loop of arms over his head, so he was effectively giving his buddy a piggyback. He took another second to arrange his guns, then headed through the same alley that Kaiser, Fenja, and Menja had gone through before the fight started. Sundancer was going the opposite way, so she said a brief goodbye and left. Neuter and Labyrinth were walking in the same direction as Bitch and I, so we walked together. Labyrinth walked like she was in a daze, with Neuter leading her along by the hand like she was a child. It was interesting, not just to see that kind of interaction between them, but noting that her gloves looked like cloth and that he was probably risking drugging her, unless she was immune. A consequence of her ability? He caught me looking, smiled and shrugged. "Autistic?" I guessed. He shook his head. "No, though we thought that at first. Seems she was a normal kid until her powers showed up. Since then, she's been off in her own little world, more or less. A little worse right now, I think, after seeing me hurt." "That happens?" I asked, gesturing towards my head, unable to come up with an inoffensive and simple way of phrasing it. He shrugged. "Sometimes getting powers fucks up your body." He gestured to himself, using his tail, which was still holding the paper bags. "Sometimes it fucks up your head. Bad luck, but you deal with the cards you're dealt." "Oh," I replied. I wasn't sure how to respond. A cold, quiet horror crept up on me. My powers had something to do with my brain. I could remember how crazy I'd felt right after my powers showed up, that torrent of nightmare images, signals, and details from my bugs. I still had bad dreams about it. How close had I come to being like that permanently? He grinned. "It's cool. She's really fond of us, and we're attached to her too. She has her lucid moments when she's let us know she's cool with the status quo. Sure, she has bad days when she's dead to the world, but all of our powers have drawbacks, yeah?" "Yeah," I echoed him, though I couldn't think of a drawback to my power that even came close. "I think we're okay where we're at, Elle? You've been happy since we got you out of that place?" Labyrinth kind of stirred from her daze and looked at him. "Yeah," Neuter grinned. "You can tell because the stuff she does with her power is prettier these days." He gestured at the manhole cover. "This is where we part ways." Labyrinth glanced down where he was pointing. A moment later, a tracery of silvery lines spider-webbed out around the manhole cover, extending and forking like veins. As the lines met and sectioned off parts of the road, those bits of road lifted and flipped over, revealing a white marble texture on their undersides. When sufficiently surrounded by the expanse of cracked white marble, the manhole flipped over, revealing a silvery underside, and then popped open on an unseen hinge. A spiral stairway of more marble or ivory led down into the depths. The white walls had a faint glow to them. "Pretty cool, huh?" Neuter replied. When he stepped down onto the stair, it was solid under his foot. He held up the paper bags as he said, "Thanks, guys." "Sure thing," I replied. "Later." The manhole shut behind them, and almost immediately, the white around the manhole began to fade. I looked up at Bitch where she sat on one-eyed Brutus. Angelica and a still dusty Judas stood just behind her. She offered me a hand up onto Brutus's back. There were a lot of drawbacks to having a mask or helmet that didn't cover my entire head. If I'd sat myself down and put in the extra hours to finish my mask and expand the armored sections, maybe I wouldn't have gotten that concussion that was proving to be such a pain in my ass. The upside, though, was that it felt awesome to have the wind blowing in my hair as we rode down the empty streets. The perfect wind down from that crazy adrenaline rush that had come with going up against Oni Lee and Lung within minutes of each other. I closed my eyes and let the tension flow out of me. We rode like that for a few minutes. Bitch took turns and moved sorta aimlessly as she headed east towards the water and the beaches. Maybe she was taking evasive action in case we were being followed. Maybe she just wanted to ride. I didn't really care. I was a little disoriented when we finally stopped. Brutus padded through sand as he stepped down onto the beach. Bitch hopped down, and I followed her cue. It was still early afternoon, so the beach was deserted, and it wasn't the sort of beach that saw much tourist use anyways. A concrete wall separated the beach from the roadside above us, and a yawning hole with the rusty remains of what had once been a grate marked the exit of the various storm drains beneath the docks. Trash, rotted leaves, and one or two needles had filtered down to the sand below the drain. "Go home," Bitch ordered the dogs. One by one, they filed into the drain. I guessed they would let the transformation subside before they returned to the loft on their own. Then Bitch pulled off her mask. She gave me a derisive look. "What? You gonna change? Can't walk back like that." "I don't have a change of clothes with me, or stashed anywhere." "Well, that's fucking stupid," she answered me. "I wasn't thinking ahead when I decided to go. Sue me," I challenged her. "What are you wearing under that?" "Tank top and stretch shorts." She looked around. "It's not that cold." I sighed and unstrapped my armor enough to unzip my costume at the back. I pulled it off, far easier than putting it on, and bundled it up so all the identifiable parts of the mask and armor were hidden by fabric. The sand was damp and clammy under my bare feet. When Bitch reached for my face, I startled. She put one hand on the side of my face, and for just a fraction of a second, I thought something incredibly awkward was about to happen. Then she wrenched my head to enough of a tilt that it was almost horizontal. "You look like someone tried to hang you." "What?" I asked. She touched the side of my neck, but it wasn't possible to see that part of myself without a mirror. I did realize what she was talking about after a moment's thought. I pulled up the side of my tank top, and sure enough, there was a red-black bruise at my stomach and waist. Hiking up my top a bit more, I found another at my ribs. I knew there would be another up near my armpit and one encircling my neck. I had a giant fucking handprint on my body, courtesy of Lung. I let out a long groan, touching my neck where I felt tender. No way I can hide this from my dad. My good mood was dashed to the winds as we started trudging back to the loft. It was made all the more unpleasant because I was underdressed and barefoot, and the ground was cold under my feet. I shivered and hugged my arms to my body as best as I could, while still keeping my costume bundled up and the paper bags of money in hand. Something warm settled over my shoulders. I looked at Bitch as she finished draping her jacket over me. As she drew back, her eyebrows furrowed. Glaring at me, I wrangled the bags and my bundle of costume so I could get my arms through the sleeves and do up the buttons. It was a canvas down jacket with a fur ruff collar, but it was the wrong size for me, and it was heavy. The pockets I found as I tried to jam my hands in there were filled with stuff. A mess of plastic bags, chocolate bars, protein bars, a juice box, pellets that ground together, what I guessed were dog treats or dog food. Not exactly cape supplies. All in all, it was almost uncomfortable, but it was warm. "Thank you," I told her, floored by the gesture. "You needed something to cover your neck." She looked bothered. "People would stare." "Doesn't matter. Thank you." I offered a smile. "You already said that." She switched from looking bothered to looking angry. "It's mine. I can take it back." "Of course," I said. Then to be safe, I offered, "Do you want to?" She didn't reply, leaving me absolutely baffled. Why was it that when I thanked someone like my dad for giving me a gift, it felt like it sounded sarcastic or lame, no matter how I tried to say it, but the one damn time I was 95% sure I sounded as sincere as I felt, it was with Bitch, and she didn't buy it? Worried anything I could say would rub her the wrong way, I defaulted to silence as I found myself doing more and more often with her. It wasn't a short trip, and my feet still felt the heat leaching out of them as I took each step on the pavement, but the core of my body was warm, and that was enough to keep me going. Like that, we made our way back to the loft. She unlocked the door and let us in. I shouted up for Brian and Lisa, but no voices greeted me in return. The others weren't back yet, which made sense, since Gru would have to pick up Tattletale and Regent before they got back, and it hadn't sounded like Tattletale's team was close to wrapping things up when I'd called. Bitch led the way up to the loft, and the second I was up there, I took off the jacket and wordlessly handed it to her. She was still glaring at me. What could I do? What could I say? It seemed like everything I did pissed her off, sent the wrong signal. I returned to my room in the loft and dug through the shopping bags I still had in there, finding a loose pair of jeans and a long-sleeved shirt to pull over my top. No clean socks, sadly, but there were some covers laid out on the bed. I grabbed some and dragged them behind me to the living room, where Bitch was watching TV. She gave me the evil eye, but didn't complain, as I got myself bundled up in the covers on the other couch. She had the remote, and I was willing to let her have it. She channel surfed relentlessly, settling on an action movie for 5 minutes, then started surfing again when the ads started, and didn't go back to it. It wasn't too interesting to watch, but I didn't mind. I lay back, thinking back to the events of the day, the conversations, the tidbits of info. I almost dozed off when my lazy train of thought stumbled onto something that I was afraid I'd forget if I let myself go the rest of the way to sleep. I forced myself to open my eyes and sat up a bit. Bitch? I risked drawing her attention, hoping she'd calm down a bit. She looked at me. When we were talking a little bit ago, I thanked you. Did that sound sarcastic to you, or what? You're getting on my case again. No, I raised my hands to stop her. Not what I was trying to do. I'm just wondering. Keep your wondering to yourself, she snapped. When she turned her attention back to the TV, her channel surfing was cranked up a notch. I'll pay you to answer me, I tried. She looked at me. That money we grabbed, you can keep all of it. Her eyes narrowed. We're supposed to split our take 5 ways. We earned that, right? The both of us? I won't tell the others if you don't, and I'm saying you can have it all. Not sure how much it is, but it'd be yours. Is this a trick? No trick. Just answer my question. You can even tell me to get lost after. I'll go to my room and grab a nap or something. She leaned back and put the hand with the remote in her lap, glaring at me. I took that for consent. So, what I was asking before, when I said thanks, did you think I was sarcastic? Did you think I was genuine? What? Dunno. You mean you didn't know, or you can't remember, or... I said dunno. Fine, I sighed. Whatever. Money's yours. That easy? I shrugged. You said you'd get lost if I asked, she pointed out. I nodded, gathered the covers, and retreated to my room. I didn't nap, though. Instead, I stared up at the iron girders that framed the ceiling, deep in thought, thinking about the conversation with Neuter about Labyrinth. I was still sorting through my thoughts when the rest of the gang returned. I ventured out of the room, still bundled in a blanket, to greet them. Brian gave me a winning smile as he pulled off his helmet, and I got some attention for having the most noteworthy injury of the afternoon. As Alec, Brian, and Bitch started talking about their individual adventures, Lisa pulled me aside. We wound up walking to the kitchen. Lisa put a kettle on as she asked me, "You okay?" "Not really hurt, ugly as this looks, and I think I'm feeling better about the school thing." "But you're distracted by something." "I was talking to Neuter. You know Labyrinth's kind of out of it because of her power, right? You want to know if there's anything wrong with you that you don't know about?" "No," I shook my head. "Wait, is there?" "Nah." "So what's up?" "Bitch." "Ah. I've been thinking, but I don't want to build up some theory in my head, make an assumption, and embarrass myself. Tell me what you're thinking, and I'll tell you if you're wrong." She's really good at reading body language, right? She could read Brian even when he was blurred by his darkness with a mask on. It's what, some kind of minor power of hers? Some of it's natural ability. Some of it's, that her power adjusted how she thinks, so she can communicate better with her dogs. Right, I glanced down the hall to where the others were talking. Or rather, where Brian and Alec were talking, and Bitch was standing there. That's the thing. What I'm thinking is, maybe when her power gave her the ability to understand dogs, it overwrote something else? Fucked up her ability to deal with people? Lisa turned and got some mugs out of the cupboard. She gave me an apologetic half smile. Yeah, something like that. So, what, she can't read expressions or tone? All the cues we give to others as a part of regular conversation? She doesn't get them. She probably couldn't learn them with a year of concerted effort. It's not just that she doesn't get it. The most basic interactions are messed up by the canine psychology that's hardwired into her head. You smile at her and ask her how she's doing. Her first thought is that you're baring your teeth at her in anger, and she has to remind herself you aren't. But even after that, she's probably wondering if you were being sarcastic or condescending or kind or whatever. She knows you aren't shouting at her from your tone of voice. but we don't always raise our voices when we're angry, you know? Yeah. And she falls back on the one thing she does get, canine behavior, because it does work on a level. Bids for dominance, eye contact, pack hierarchies, and establishing territory, all adjusted and adapted to her human life. So she's not really a sociopath. No, not so much. Why didn't you say anything? I realized belatedly that I sounded accusatory. Maybe I was right to, because she'd leave if she heard about it. And for reasons I don't know, the boss wants her to stick with us. She spent her whole life accepting the fact that she had a shitty childhood, and it made her into a screwed up person. Her dogs are the only thing that's normal and right for her. If she found out that the reason she's so messed up is the very same thing that makes her so close to her dogs, she let the thought hang. Got it, I replied. So not another word of this, please, unless it's absolutely necessary, and you're absolutely 100% positive she's not going to overhear. Do the others know? I don't think it would change much, and I don't trust those two to keep a secret. Brian is, I don't want to say too honest, but he's transparent, and bitch can read him. Alec would forget and let it slip as part of a joke. He doesn't get the gravity of stuff, sometimes. Okay. She poured a cup and stirred it, then handed me a mug of Ovaltine. She got the other mugs arranged on a tray and carried it through to the living room. I stayed where I was to think. I was reminded of a nonfiction book I'd read where a kid got halfway through high school before his teachers realized he was illiterate. He did it by being the class clown, by acting out. Was bitch the same? The violence and hostility could be a cover to distract from her own inability to interact, at least partially. I guessed a fair bit of it was genuine, though. She had had a crappy childhood. She had lived on the streets and had fought tooth and nail to get by and avoid arrest. But at the end of the day, as awkward as I felt in day-to-day interactions, she was 100 times worse off.